going to take a step further aside here on WRHU. We'll welcome in now Eric Reed, trainer of the 2022 Kentucky Derby winner, Rich Strike. Eric, thank you for taking the time to join us on WRHU today.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start off by talking to you about when you first got an opportunity to look at Rich Strike. Rich Strike didn't start with you. You claimed him on September 17th, 2021 at Churchill Downs. So I wanted to ask you sort of what you saw about Rich Strike in that claiming race and what you had seen from him in his first start and what made you think you might want to take a shot, put a claim on him, and what you thought you could do with him in your barn.
Well, the first thing was we were actually looking at another horse that was in that race, and I came across Rich Strike because I was trying to see if anyone in the race could beat the one that we were going to claim. And I just kept noticing he had all those bullet workouts. You know, he was working extremely fast for a 2-year-old. And then I noticed that he had run, but he ran last. So it kind of made me stop and take another look. And then I kind of put 2 and 2 together. They ran him on the turf going a mile. And I was checking his pedigree out, and I didn't see much turf in it. I thought, well, they probably were just running him for the mile rather than the turf. And, of course, the 30 claimer was on the dirt. And he had worked so well on the dirt. It was kind of a gamble. But being by a son of Curlin, I just thought that it probably was going to be all right because 2-year-olds don't work that fast unless they have some talent. And I was just gambling that the turf is the reason of the last place finish, and obviously it was.
And so when you got him in your barn, what did you notice from him physically as a horse? Because you said you'd been seeing the bullet workouts with him. What was some of the big things that stood out to you about him as a physical talent?
He was a great big raw bone horse. You know, he had a huge body on him, but he just didn't seem to know what he was there to do. When we took him to the track after we claimed him, he had run really well in that race, but when he galloped around, I mean, you could tell he just really didn't know what he was supposed to do, so I knew there was a lot of upside in the horse. So we started putting some horses in front of him as he galloped, and then we got him a little bit more aggressive. And that's why I put him in the race at Keeneland, just to see if coming out of the maiden 30, I mean, you go from maiden 30 to an allowance at Keeneland, you're catching some pretty good horses. And that was really just a test to see if he had learned anything or what kind of potential was there. And, I mean, he probably should have won that race. So then I knew we had something special.
And when you saw that with him, did that give you the confidence to move him up to Stakes Company? Because you ran him in a few black-type races following that October 9th allowance at Keeneland.
Yeah, really, I just I knew that the way he ran over the Churchill track and that he was just getting warmed up. And I believe that day he ran the final furlong in 12 flat, and that was, you know, being eased up. So I just, you know, you've always got the dream of a 2-year-old that can go long over the Churchill track, that as a 3-year-old you might be able to do something like that. So I thought, man, this horse got a lot of room to improve. We definitely haven't seen the best of him, and we kind of mapped out a plan to start there at the fairgrounds and let him tell us what was going on. And he didn't run very well in that race. He was 5th, I believe, but he was very immature in the race, and everything that could go wrong in the 4 days leading to the race did. And that's kind of when I realized he's very one-dimensional. You can't change his pattern because it messes him up, and that's what happened down there. So at that point, I knew I only had 2 or 3 more chances to get points, and Turfway was our home base. He'd always trained well there, and I thought, well, let's try to get the points at Turfway, and that's why we chose the course we did.
And did any of the early, you mentioned Turfway was your home base, did any of the early start at Ellis on turf influence that plan, or was it more of an idea of this is the place where we can get points, we know that he works well over this surface, we'll try him here?
That's what it was. I mean, we didn't want to put him on a van and haul him 1,000 miles each direction, you know, for races in New Orleans, or 800 miles to Oaklawn Park. You know, if we did get the points doing all that traveling, he probably wouldn't have any legs to run in the race. And I knew if I could keep him at home and he would handle that track. And truthfully, if he didn't run well in the first stake, then we were going to have to go back and start trying to find a spot to get points on the dirt, and it would have been a lot of traveling. So we got lucky that the first time we ran him at Turfway, he liked the track and showed us that he could probably win one of those preps.
And you said that he was, in some of his early races, that he was a little bit raw, didn't really know what he was doing. Did you see a maturity grow with him across those races at Turfway, the first couple leading up to the Ruby?
I saw maturity from the race in New Orleans to the first stake at Turfway. I could see he was starting to get more focused. And then after that stake at Turfway leading up to the Battaglia, he trained much better. So I could see he was moving forward. And it was in the Battaglia that Sonny told me, he says, we've got the horse if we can get the points.
And so, you said the Battaglia. What was the biggest thing that stood out from his run there to you going into the Ruby and gave you guys the confidence that if you could get the points, you could get him to the race?
Well, he got in a lot of trouble in that race. He was running so hard down the stretch, and that's a tough track to close on, especially with a short stretch at Turfway on the synthetic. And he was running over horses in that race. If he'd have got a clean trip, he in my opinion, was going to win. And the gallop out was huge. So we just, we knew at that point if he stayed healthy between there and the Jeff Ruby, we'd have a real shot to win at 1 1/8 in the Jeff Ruby. And unfortunately, the track was so speed biased that day that it didn't look like we were going to have any chance at all. And matter of fact, Jimmy McNerney, the track announcer, called me a couple races before the Ruby, and he said, "Man, you're up against it today." He said, "I'm calling these races." And he said, "I don't think I've called anybody further than fourth that hit the board." And, it was Richie's style either way back there again. But he did manage to get going just enough to get up to get third and get that 20 points.
And what did you see from him in that effort there, coming from last and on a day where you mentioned that it was not favorable to closers? What did you make of that run to be able to get up and get third and lose to a couple of solid horses on top of that, but also just with the way the track was playing that day?
Well, it showed he matured a lot. It showed he never gave up in his races. I mean, he was trying all the way, and then as soon as the races were over, the other horses were spent, and he was just getting really going. I mean, in that 1 1/8, when he galloped out around him again, I've told a bunch of people if the racing form would put down the gallop out, another line after he'd have been the favorite in the Derby because he was 8 or 9 in front of everybody galloping out in every race. But the form doesn't show it. So if you didn't see the race, you didn't see what we saw after the finish line. And we knew he liked Churchill. We knew we were getting ready to get another furlong to run on. And I knew when he got on the dirt, he was going to take another big step forward.
And I want to follow up on that. How did you, going into the Kentucky Derby, you were getting the extra distance there with the 1 1/4. How did you feel that was going to suit him going up to that 1 1/4 distance?
I knew probably half the horses couldn't run that far. And if he got a good trip, that would put him beating half the field. And there's just this little spot inside of me that thought, he loves the track. He's getting better. He's not reached his best race. Most of these horses already had. He's not traveled. He's not worn out. And we really was hoping, to hit the board and thought that with his closing kick, he could do that. But the biggest thing was he's going to pass 20 horses because I knew he was going to be last at one point early in the race. It's just the way he is. And he was a little farther back than I thought coming out of the first turn, but then the speed, started to back up going into the second turn. And I knew as we got in there, he was within 8 or 10 lengths with a half mile to go. And I thought, well, I know I'm not going to get tired. It's just, can he get through that blob of horses?
So I want to take a little bit of a backtrack. Rich Strike was originally and also eligible for the 2022 Kentucky Derby. And if you could you tell us a little bit about how that morning was like when you found out that he was going to get into the Kentucky Derby? Because it was very, very close to the deadline when he got into the Derby. What it was like when you found out you were going to get into the race?
I wish I could bottle up the emotions you get when that happens, but we had been told at 8:45 by one of the guys assigned to us that he had not heard of any scratches and that we wasn't going to get in. At that time, the security guard that was assigned to us got a phone call, and then she packed up her stuff, closed her chair, gave me a big hug and said, I'm sorry, but they've told me I don't need to be here anymore. So we knew we were out at that point. And I made a phone call to my father and a couple friends. And then Marty McGee with the Daily Race Forum, he sent me a text asking did I want to make a statement about not getting in but being so close. And I did. Kind of a private, funny joke that I sent him, and then I just told him, it was a great opportunity. Somebody had to be the bubble boy, and I was glad I got that close, as close as I thought I'd get. And a couple minutes before 9, which was the deadline, then the phone rang, and it was Churchill Downs, and it was Barbara Borden asking me, did I want to run in the Derby on Saturday?
And, when you get that phone call, you said, you wish you'd be able to bottle up the emotions there. From that point, you're in the Kentucky Derby. Does your mindset go to, we always thought if we could get the points, we could run well. Now that you're in the race, your expectations were that you were going to beat some horses and you were going to hit the board, yes?
Yeah, I thought we could hit the board for sure. I knew in my heart he would split the field at worst. And the biggest thing that happened to me once we got in was the 1,000 pounds I was carrying on my back for getting, family, my father, the help. I wanted those guys to enjoy the Derby and get to make the walkover and say they participated. So at that point, I'd accomplished about everything I thought I would with the race. And the rest of it, we were just hoping for a good outcome from him. Little did we know how good it was going to be.
And I want to ask you if you could describe what the walkover for the Kentucky Derby is like, because it's so often described as a very emotional, very overwhelming experience. Could you talk about what the walkover is like, and the lead up saddling, and then when they come out on the track and they play My Old Kentucky Home, all that pomp and circumstance?
If you're in the horse business, it's got to be like winning an Oscar or a Super Bowl or World Series. They make the call to get your horses ready for the walkover, and you start preparing, and the butterflies are going, and you're emotionally wrecked. And then they say bring them to the to the track, to the chute, to get ready for the walkover. So then you get on the track and you're walking around for 5 or 6 minutes while they're waiting on all the horses to get there so they can start over. And you can feel the energy. I mean, you can just feel it. And then they say, okay, let's, they point to the first horse, and then you start to walk over. And as you approach the crowd, the roar of the crowd, you can feel it. You can feel the noise hit your body as you're walking. And of course, it just gets louder as you go. And the horses are so well schooled for it that they took it a lot better than we did. I was nervous. I kept thinking the noise was going to scare the horse or all the other horses. And everybody did such a professional job that the horses were just, really good on the walkover. And then as you walk in the paddock through the tunnel, you got all the fans on both sides, and they're screaming your name and the horse's name. And then you walk into the actual paddock, and it's jam-packed with owners and friends and, of course, 20 horses. And then you just go to work. It's business as usual. Get the saddle, have a little talk with the rider, enjoy what's happening. And then when they say riders up and the My Old Kentucky Home starts, I mean, it gets real, real, real emotional.
And so I want to go to the actual running of the race. You sort of described it a little bit earlier, but that was an insanely fast pace in that Kentucky Derby. Did you have a sense as to how fast they were going in that race?
I remember my father looked over at me after the half mile, and he says, "Boy, they've burned it up." He goes, "We don't have to worry about those 3 horses." And I really kind of zoned out at that point because I was watching, where Richie was during the race. So I didn't pay attention to any more fractions. But when I saw the half-mile split, I knew everybody that was probably 5th place or back had a big, big shot. They really set it up for anybody that wasn't up there in the top 3 or 4 horses.
And when he started to make his move, when did you pick him up that he was moving in the race?
Well, I saw him catch the group going into the turn, which is with a half mile to go. Lost him all the way around the turn, never saw him. And I looked over at my best buddy, Ken Tyson, and I said, KT, I said, I can't find him. Where is he? And he goes, man, you're on the rail. He said, you're 5th. So then I saw the red blinkers, and I knew that was me. A lot of people, when he won the race, thought it was the 2 horse. Because you couldn't see the saddle tail so well, but I knew it was Richie because of the blinkers. But at that point, it was really exciting because he was already in 5th with a quarter mile to go. I knew nobody was going to pass him. And I was like, well, no matter what, we're going to leave here with respect. And then mid-stretch, he almost ran over Medina's, I can't think of that horse's name off the top of my head, but it was Keem's horse, but that horse was stopping really fast, and Sonny had to make a split-second decision, and he pulled around him just at the last minute, or he probably clips heels with him, and I thought that would stymie the momentum he had, but he hit another gear after that, and I realized I was in third place. So I told my father at that point, I said, "My God, we're going to hit the board," and I looked up. Tyson started saying, "Oh my God, oh my God," he was getting louder and louder. And then I realized, we were catching the front two, and we were about to him. And right about the time he put a head in front, my buddy Scott Wilson kind of slammed me on the back, and I went down. I didn't even see him cross the wire.
So you sort of described that at that point in the race when you saw that he was in front, you went down, and it's a moment that was caught on the TV cameras and moved a lot of people. And so I'll ask you, from what you remember, what was the feeling like when you had won the Kentucky Derby, and maybe a couple minutes afterwards when it started to, I don't know that it sinks in immediately, but when you had the realization that I've won the Kentucky Derby.
It happened so fast. I remember I was hearing a voice in my head saying, "No way, no way, no way." And then, Ken Tyson grabbed me and got me back to my feet because they were getting ready to pile on me like in the Super Bowl. And he grabbed me around the neck. I'm looking at a picture right now of him pulling me out of the paddock with his arm wrapped around my neck. And it was, it was a great day. It's a feeling that you'll never be able to describe ever. But it was like you're in another world at that point. And I had about a minute and a half of people running to me through the tunnel, telling me how happy they were. And I was, of course, inviting them all to the winner's circle. And then I looked up, and there was the NBC camera. And at that point, then your celebration time is great, but now you're being interviewed, and it just brings you back to earth, so to speak. And the rest of the time, it was just so proud because I was watching my dad enjoy it, and all my friends that were there, and it was like the Lord had blessed us in a way that you just can't even imagine being blessed.
And you sort of talked about getting to experience that with your father, and I wanted to ask you, just a little bit further, what was that like? Because he was a trainer before you. What was that like to be able to have that experience to win the Kentucky Derby alongside him?
It meant more to me that he was there than winning the race. I had been in this business for 40 years, and I'd had some good races and some wins, and I'd had a great career. But knowing that my dad not only got to be there, but he was going to get up on the stage, because I wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for him. I wouldn't have been a horse trainer if it wasn't for him. And after everything he'd gone through in his life, I think it meant more to me knowing that he was there and what it had done to him, to get there. That was the highlight. I mean, I'd trade it all. I'd trade every win I had in the world away just to watch him do that again. But, winning the race was awesome. As a trainer, it's a dream come true. But knowing my dad was standing there after everything he had been through, I felt like I'd finally given him a gift that he deserved.
And finally, when you get to the winner's circle and you're able to have that experience, what's that winner's circle experience like after you've won the Kentucky Derby? They put the roses on the horse, and you just get to have that. I know you said it's very brief, but you have it for the few moments that you do have it.
Yeah, it's awesome. You're looking out at 170, 80,000 people, and they're all cheering. And of course, that year, a lot of them were stunned. They're like, "Holy cow, who was that? What was that?" And then it was. It gets real emotional when you look up and you realize they're watching you, and you're not on TV watching the guys get the trophy. And everybody there was so happy, and I'm looking down at the people below me that were in the win photo, and man, they're chanting, and it's really, really something. And then, of course, at that moment, I remembered my son didn't get to be there. And as they were interviewing me, and the interview was ending, I took the microphone back and made, my comment out there to my son. So at home on TV, he knew that he was remembered. And that was another highlight for me.
Well, Eric Reed, trainer of the 2022 Kentucky Derby winner, Rich Strike, thank you for taking the time to join us on WRHU today.
Anytime. Thanks so much.
We'll take a step further in now, and we would like to welcome Ken McPeek, trainer of Mystic Dan and also Torpedo Anna Kentucky Derby and Kentucky Oaks contenders in this year's Kentucky Derby and Oaks, respectively. Kenny, thank you for taking the time to join us on WRHU today.
My pleasure.
So I want to start off by just talking to you in general about what it takes to get a horse to the Kentucky Derby and to have that horse be right throughout the trip, because it's a long journey through the winter, early spring to get to the Kentucky Derby. You've been you've had horses in the Kentucky Derby the past couple of years. So just if you could, what is it like to get a horse to the Kentucky Derby, and what does it entail throughout this long trail?
Well, it's a long process. I primarily specialize in buying yearlings for people. A long list of clients that come to me and say, hey, find me a good horse. And so we go to the yearling sale and scout out all the horses that have what I'd call have the right parts in the right places to run at a mile and a 16th, a mile and an eighth, a mile and a quarter. Those are the kind of races that you need to win to be able to punch your ticket to the Kentucky Derby. They don't ride a mile and a quarter race as a prep, although there's a fairgrounds race. It's close at a mile and 3/16. But, you've got to teach a horse how to run. We've got a yearling to 2-year-old breaking program that we base out of Ocala, Florida. And I've got a farm down there that we regularly have, these types of horses getting ready. And what we do is we teach them to run from the quarter pole to the wire, three furlongs to the wire. You extend them out so that they learn to run to finish. And then it's a matter of into the spring and, actually fall of the years where we are probably more active, and that the 2-year-olds in the fall are getting some distance races under their belt, and they're able to we're able to figure out whether or not they're Triple Crown types. And it's a steep mountain. Not, of course, the one horse makes it to the top and the rest of them don't. And you're just trying to find a horse and prepping timing wise to get them to the Kentucky Derby and the Kentucky Oaks. So it's a very unique path, and it takes a lot of hard work and a bit of money too.
And I want to just ask you another quick general question about the Kentucky Derby, and the walkover from the barns before the race and coming out on the track to my old Kentucky home is something that's talked about a lot by people who've had horses in the Kentucky Derby. And so I wanted to ask you, as a trainer who's done it before, what's the walkover like, and what's it like when you see the horses come out on the track for the Kentucky Derby beforehand and they play my old Kentucky home and the post parade comes in front of the grandstand?
Well, I'd call it a goosebumps moment. When you do that and the crowd's excited and you're undefeated on the way over. So on the way back, it's the harder walk when you don't win. But yes, it's a very cool experience, and you've got people hollering at you because you're walking in front of the grandstands in the middle of the turn and such, and there's a lot of people very excited and very intoxicated. So it's an unusual moment. I've done it quite a few times. While I was second in the Derby in 1995 is as close as I've gotten, and I've had the favorite in 2002, so that was an exciting day, a couple of exciting days that we didn't win, but we ran okay. But look, it's one of those ultimate challenges and lifetime experiences.
So we'll start now with the charge that you have this year, first for the Kentucky Derby. Mystic Dan, you mentioned that you're very active in the fall, and he had 3 starts as a 2-year-old. So what did you see from him early on in his career, his first couple of races as a 2-year-old?
Well, his first race was more of a test drive, and I do that a lot because I like my young horses to learn how to run, which means they've got to learn to take a little dirt in the face and overcome a bit of adversity. His second start, he won easily. which was impressive. And then his third start, I probably shouldn't have run him. We felt like he won so easy in the maiden win that we brought him back in a mile race because we knew we needed at some point to stretch him out, and he didn't run well at all. And he coughed up pretty sizable lung infection, and disappointed. But we regrouped, and we've had to reschool him since then. Now, before we go too far, I've got two that are probably going to be running the Derby. I've also got Common Defense, nice horse that broke his maiden at Oaklawn, and then I may have two in the Kentucky Oaks as well.
And you mentioned Common Defense, and do forgive me for lapsing on him as well. I'll ask you the same question about him. You say you start off with them as a trio. What was the process with him like in this past fall?
Well, he came around a lot later. I want to say he ran in December, and once again he needed a bit of a schooling, and he got a little dirt in his face and handled that okay, and then came back in his second start and won pretty impressively. But he's been a horse that, I'm leaning towards in the long run he might end up being a turf horse, but in the short run I do think he does have an opportunity or a chance to get in the race, and we probably are going to give him a try, although I think he's a fringe horse. And I do think his long-term future, like I've already said, is on the grass. But he big, long-shotted horse, and had a really nice race at Oaklawn in the Rebel. That's gotten him enough points to think that he might get in. But, look, a lot of things happen, as we learned with Rich Strike. This is a race that there are no givens.
So you mentioned the Oaklawn Kentucky Derby trail races, and you've had starters in all four of those races going back to January. So I'll talk to you about go back to Mystic Dam, because he ran in the Smarty Jones and then in the Southwest. Didn't run too well in the Smarty Jones, but what did you see from him in between the Smarty Jones race and then moving on into the Southwest, which is the race that he won on this trail?
Well, the Smarty Jones, I think he needed the race. We missed a little bit of time coming out of the lung infection. We had to put him on some antibiotics and get that cleared up. And then we only had a couple of works going into the Smarty Jones, and he was pretty keen in the race, and then just got leg weary. And then after that, I moved him to the fairgrounds because we were dealing with weather, and looked like ice storms were coming in. So I hauled him out of Oaklawn down to the fairgrounds, and then we got him in a work routine down in the fairgrounds, which teed him up for the Southwest. And I think that contributed to his big run in the Southwest. And then we couldn't come back. We didn't want to come back quick into the Rebel. We wanted to space it, because when we'd come back quick once, he had that's when he got the lung infection. But we waited on the Arkansas Derby. So the spacing for the Arkansas Derby was 7 weeks, which is a pretty wide time typically. But he really had a rough trip in the Arkansas Derby. Got turned sideways in the first turn, and was with an excuse. I think he could have run a little bit better. But I do think that he's got the improvement in him. And if he runs back to his Southwest race, he's going to be, I think he'll be in the money without any trouble.
And so you mentioned you didn't run him in the Rebel because it would have been too quick of a turnaround, but Common Defense ran second in the Rebel behind a nice horse in Timberlake. So what did you see from his effort in Common Defense's effort in the Rebel?
Well, he didn't handle the mud at the Southwest, so the Rebel was on a dry track, and he ran a lot better on a dry track. I've referenced it. I think he might be a better grass horse because he's by Caracani, but he is out of a street crime mare, which is bottom line dirt stallion. And he's a horse that'll run all day. I mean, the distance, it is non-issue how far he'll go. He's got a ton of stamina. I actually ventured to nominate him to the English Derby because I think he'll make that distance of ground. But that race would be a backup to what we're doing, in Kentucky here, obviously.
You mentioned a little bit earlier the fact that most of the races on the Kentucky Derby Trail are not at the 1.25 mile distance, but the Louisiana Derby is just a bit shorter at the mile and 3/16 distance, and I'm curious to ask you what you think the benefits of a race like that, because Common Defense ran in the Louisiana Derby last out. What are the benefits of a race like that at the distance of so close to the distance of the Kentucky Derby does for a horse going into the Kentucky Derby?
Well, you learn what kind of stamina they have and whether, how far they can go. I mean, he didn't get beat very far in the Louisiana Derby to Sierra Leone, and Sierra Leone's going to be the favorite, obviously, or one of the favorites. So, it is a good barometer of which horses are going to handle that. And, like anything, pace of the race and what kind of trip horses have. Some riders have great rides and they have bad rides, and as long as they don't get in trouble, and who gets through on the rail, and so there's a lot of unknowns, and that's what makes it so unique.
So switching gears now, we'll move over to the Kentucky Oaks. Torpedo Anna, winner of the Fantasy Stakes. I want to talk to you, though, about the progression that you've seen from her first couple of starts as a 2-year-old, the runner-up effort in the Goldenrod, into that Fantasy Stakes win that she had off of the big break. So first of all, what did you see from her in the first 2 starts that she had in Maiden and Allowance Company in the fall?
Well, she's just freaky talented. I actually wouldn't be scared to run this filly in the Kentucky Derby if she had the points to get in. I mean, she's high-level talent. She's been a workmate of Mystic Dan's, and she gives him everything he can handle. And I, like I said, very confident in our Oaks runner there. She her first 2 starts were freaky good, and his third start I wheeled her back quick again, and she ran a good second, but wasn't her best race. And then she had a little setback in December. She evidently bumped or bruised her hip in the stall, and she was pretty significantly lame behind for about 3 weeks. We had to turn her out for a month. Turned out it was nothing more than a deep bruise on her hip, and we think she either hit it on the entrance to the door or did it actually in the stall. We're not sure, but anyway, that set her timing back pretty significantly, or else she would have probably run a couple of times already this year. But the race on a rebound race was freaky good, and she draws off and wins by 5 in an excellent time. Some say it's the best 3-year-old filly speed figure in the nation this year. That's leading me over there pretty confident. I mean, I like to say that they better bring a bear because I'm bringing a grizzly. I think she's a very bettable filly. I think Tarifa will probably be the favorite just because of the connections. But Torpedo Ann are going to kick her butt.
And to follow up on that, I want to ask you, what does it say about the talent that she has to be able to draw off and win in the manner that she did in the Fantasy, having been off for the amount of time that she was off for?
Well, just raw talent. I mean, she washed out in the post parade. She was very nervous, and we felt like we were only taking her over there 80%. So imagine if she's 100% for the Kentucky Oaks, and she's more composed. Like I said, she got nervous. There was a lot of talk about how washy she was. She's just a very high energy filly, which can be a really good thing, and it can be a bad thing. And our job, we're going to paddock school her a lot. She's going to get a lot of trips around Churchill to get used to the scenery. And at Oaklawn, she had only been there for 72 hours, so she didn't get much of a chance to really get a feel for the place. And then she went out there and did her job anyway. So it's probably the best shot I've had in the Oaks. I've been at second in the Oaks 3 times, and for those that watch Talladega Nights, Ricky Bobby, if you're not first, you're last. And so I've been second in that race. Was kind of frustrating race for me, and I've been second in the Kentucky Derby too. So we'll see if we can, put those to rest.
And from a distance perspective, the 1 1/8 of the Kentucky Oaks, how do you feel that she'll handle that distance? And Also, toward that end, having a couple of runs at Churchill Downs already in her career, how do you think that helps her as well?
Yeah, that's a big edge. She's not going to have any trouble getting a mile and an eighth. She's not going to have any problem handling the scenery at Churchill. It's home for her, and like I said, it gives me that much more confidence in her ability to get it done. Just hope she breaks well and she has a fair trip.
Well, once again, Ken McPeek, trainer of several of the horses that will be running across this weekend in the Kentucky Oaks and the Kentucky Derby. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us on this program today.
My pleasure.
And we wish you best of luck as well this weekend. Thank you, Kenny.
You're welcome.
We're going to move on now, and I'd like to introduce my next guest on this WRHU Breeders' Cup special, and that is Hall of Fame trainer Mark Casse, and also a three-time Breeders' Cup winner. And Mark is going to have two entrants in the Breeders' Cup upcoming on Friday. The juvenile fillies, he'll have Wonder Wheel, who is 5-1 choice right now on the morning line and is going to be one of the favorites for that race. And he'll also have Web Slinger in the juvenile turf. So, Mark, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, you're welcome.
So we'll talk about Wonder Wheel first, and she was the winner of the Alcibiades last time at Keeneland over this surface, and just a question about her coming out of that race. How did you feel that she performed there, and how do you feel she is going up into this Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies?
You know, I thought she performed well. She had a great trip in the Alcibiades. I mean, some other horses had a little trouble in the race, but more importantly, I think she's come out of that race and really moved forward. She's training well. We got a good post, which is extremely important with these fillies, these 2-year-olds running into that turn. You know, the turn comes up pretty quickly going a mile and 16th.
And when you won the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, the Colts iteration of this race back in 2016 with Classic Empire, he prepped at Keeneland in the Breeders' Futurity. How important is it for Wonder Wheel to have success over this Keeneland surface going into the Breeders' Cup? I know in the case of Classic Empire, he had run at Santa Anita, but with Wonder Wheel having the experience at Keeneland, how important is that?
Well, I think that it's extremely important, and it was important to Classic Empire. It's always nice to get a 2-turn race into them, before the Breeders' Cup. It's even better when you can do it at the racetrack that you're going to run the Breeders' Cup at. So, I think we definitely have a advantage with that. We've ran 2 turns and we're running over a racetrack that we won on. And
I don't want to belabor the point too much, but there are the favorite right now on the morning line for the juvenile fillies has the run over the course at Aqueduct Chocolate Gelato, but that was a 1-turn mile, and you mentioned your fillies got the 2-turn experience, and obviously you've won a 2-year-old Breeders' Cup race before with a horse having the 2-turn experience. So could you just elaborate further on what the benefits are in this stage of the game, having the experience around the 2 turns?
Well, it's there. To me, it's a big deal. You see a lot of horses that will run 1 turn, and you'll say, well, they'll be fine at 2 turns. But you never know. You got to remember now, we're going to break from the gate. The riders are going to ask their horses to run, and they're going to get good position. And then all at once, they're going to be running right into this turn, and that's something that a lot of them don't handle well. You watch a lot of 2-year-old races when the first time they run a mile and a 16th and they run into the turn, some of them don't handle it well. So it's a big advantage. I think over the years, the New York horses have struggled to coming off those 1-turn races and then going and trying to run 2 turns. It's why I've kind of always used the Breeders' Futurity and the Alcibiades because it's a 2-turn race. Last year, I did it with Papa Cap. I ran him in the American Pharoah, which was out in California, but it was 2 turns. So I think it's important, and I definitely think we have an advantage there.
And how would you want to see her race play out, Wonder Wheel's race play out as the trainer in this? You mentioned you got a good draw in the race. For her to be able to win, what kind of a trip do you want to see her be able to work out? And what would you say needs to happen for her to run her A race in this race?
Well, again, the break's going to be important. Going into the first turn is going to be important. To me, it looks like there's some serious speed in the race. I'm just hoping that, Tyler's able to get her to settle maybe right behind the speed. If she breaks running and nobody wants it, she'll be on the lead. But I don't see that happening on Friday. I think there's a fair amount of speed. We just want to get through the first turn safe and happy. And then, we have the short run, the short stretch on this race. So you're going to need to, Tyler's going to have to position himself to be not very far off the lead going into the far turn. So good news is Tyler does a great job, and this filly has the ability. She has speed, but she has already shown the ability to settle.
Just want to touch briefly on your other runner on Friday, Web Slinger in the Juvenile Turf. He's coming out of a win in the Now Stakes at Monmouth. How would you rate his performance in that race last time, and then looking towards the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf on Friday?
I thought his race was really good. He kind of got shuffled back. He made a big wide run. Again, he was running his first time around 2 turns. He ran down a nice horse, Oxymore of Chad Brown's, and I thought it was really good. The 2-year-old turf there's horses coming from everywhere, so it's hard to really know where you fit in. So that's going to be interesting. But he's a nice horse. He's training well. He looks great. And, the post isn't bad. 10's not too bad. Hopefully Dylan is able to get a nice pocket to drop into going into the first turn.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Good luck this Friday with your horses, and hopefully we'll be able to speak to you soon with some positive results.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Here on the Kentucky Derby preview show with jockey Florent Geroux, who will be riding Just a Touch, the runner-up from the Bluegrass Stakes in this year's Kentucky Derby. First of all, Florent, thank you for taking the time to join us today on WRHU.
You're welcome, and thank you for the invite.
So first of all, I want to ask you about Just a Touch, going back to only 3 starts in his career, going back to January 27th when he broke his maiden at the fairgrounds. What did you see from him in the lead up to the race, and then what were your thoughts about his win exiting the maiden win that he had on January 27th?
He's a horse who's always been very very promising since day one, since he arrived at the Brad Cox barn, and I was able to breed him a few times prior his first race, and honestly we anticipated a very good run from him, and he did not disappoint.
And to sort of follow up on that, you said you were anticipating a good run from him. What did you make of the performance that he had on debut?
No, as the plans needed, it was. I remember it was. It rained, the day before, the day of, and the track was sloppy. So it's always a little bit of a concern when you run on this type of racetrack. But no, he was able to handle everything fine, and it was no problem for him.
And how much growth did you see from him from that first career start to his first stakes effort where he was second in the Gotham at Aqueduct?
I just thought, it was not really ideal, to run over there straight in a grey stakes, but there was no other plan, another race for him. So Brad and his team had to ship him over there and run over there in a Gotham, but he still ran a great race and just got beat, by a nice horse of Christophe Clement. And from there, I just thought, it was a very messy day once again for him. The first 2 races he ran on, it was very messy track, and especially at Aqueduct. It rained, pretty much since I arrived there at 9 o'clock in the morning all the way until 6 at night, and he was just pouring rain, like really hard, and the track condition were not perfect. Let's say this way.
And so you mentioned that it wasn't an ideal spot for him to come back in a graded stakes race after his maiden effort. What did you think when you saw him run the second place race that he did? What did you think that said about his talent, that he was able to go in an unideal circumstance, graded stakes race after not having faced winners before in his career, and with the conditions being the way that they were? What do you think that said about him as a talent?
Well, it just shows, he has a bright future, and look like we throw a lot of things at him, in a very short period of time, and he always respond very well to what we asking him. From there, we know we have a horse, with a lot of quality. Ideally, will be better if he has another, race or two under his belt, coming into the Kentucky Derby. But those are the card, we are dwelt, and we're gonna play it by ear. But look at last year, Mage was already was able to win the Kentucky Derby with only 3 runs, so it could be done. It's not easy, but it's possible, and we have a very good horse, and I'm hoping he can duplicate what Mage did last year.
And going to his third career start in the Bluegrass, what were you and the team, Brad and the folks in the barn, thinking you were going to get out of him in his third career start, which was the Bluegrass, off of the couple of runs that you'd seen from him already?
Oh, we thought he would appreciate a little bit the extra distance, going from a mile to a mile and 8. He's a horse with a very nice way of going, a beautiful stride. Look like he covers a lot of ground, so usually it gives you an indication of the horse would, appreciate to go a little bit further, which he did, and I thought he ran a great race. We only got beat, by the serious horse, probably one of the main contender for the Derby. There's a horse also with a little more experience, who ran, 2 times prior to that, 2 turns, and us, it was our first time. So it's a big difference. And I'm hoping our horse, can move up again. And hopefully it's good enough to win the race, but it won't be easy. But like I said, I have faith on the horse.
And you referenced Mage a little bit, and he did run a strong second, Just a Touch did, in the Bluegrass. So what are your thoughts about his run there, and how do you think the Kentucky Derby is going to suit him? Because you mentioned that the team thought that he would appreciate the move up to the mile and an 1/8, and how do you think the move up to a mile and a quarter will suit him in the Kentucky Derby?
Well, like I said, I don't think he has any distance limitation. I thought in the Bluegrass, there's some kind of like a little bit of indication when the horse, got past at the end, but also, he got out pretty good. Usually when they don't want to go the extra distance, they pretty much shut down right past the wire or before the wire. It was not the case for him. So, no, we'll see. I mean, like I said, it won't be easy, but it can definitely be done.
And lastly, I want to just quickly transition away from the Kentucky Derby for a moment. It was announced today that Gunrunner, a horse you rode to a Breeders' Cup Classic win and a Horse of the Year title in 2017, was inducted to the Racing Hall of Fame today. So I just wanted to ask you your thoughts on Gunrunner getting inducted to the Hall of Fame, and what that horse meant for you in your career.
Well, it meant a lot, like I said, not really surprised, he's in the Hall of Fame, was after what he was able to achieve in a very short period of time. And not only as a racehorse, but now his legacy keep on going with his second career as a stallion. He's a tremendous stallion, and his racing prospects are just simply amazing. They run pretty much on anything, and any kind of distances, and he throws, runners after runners. And and like I said, he was a horse who beat me last time. This Sierra Leone is going to be one of the favorites for the Derby, and he's going to be pretty very live in the Kentucky Derby.
All right, Florent Geroux, rider of Just a Touch. Thank you for taking the time to join us on WRHU today. Best of luck in the Kentucky Derby.
Thank you very much.
And we are joined now by my friend and former correspondent from the Daily Racing Forum, Jay Privman. Jay joined us last November when I did the Breeders' Cup show here on WRHU, and I'm delighted to welcome Jay back on for some Kentucky Derby discussion. So, Jay, lovely to have you back here on WRHU.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Jack.
So where else to get started but with the likely favorite for this year's Kentucky Derby. In Forte last out, he won the Florida Derby. And start off, Jay, your thoughts on the effort that he had in the Florida Derby?
Kind of mixed feelings about it. It was a warm day down there, and it got very washy, which you don't usually want to see, but you can allow for it owing to how hot it was in South Florida on Florida Derby Day. But his race to me was just okay. He had to work a little harder, I think, than you might have expected, considering the level of competition that it looked like he was up against that day. So I'm kind of torn about him, about that race. On one hand, you could say, well, gee, maybe he's starting to tail off a little bit. But on the other hand, you could say, you know, he's so good that even on a day when he wasn't at his absolute best, he still won. And that's a significant thing to pull off. So for me, he's a really important horse to watch in terms of his workouts leading up to the Kentucky Derby, because I think that, at least from my standpoint, is going to be impactful as to whether I think he won on a day when he was just off and he's come back and worked well, or if he by chance were to not work well coming out of the race, then I would look at him as a horse who maybe is starting to go the other direction.
And that's a good place to pick up with the potential other direction, because he did regress slightly from his first start this year in the Fountain of Youth on the Beyer Speed Figure scale. Is that something that you're at all concerned with Forte going into the Derby?
I think the Beyer Speed Figures are very important, and so that's something that I always take into consideration. But, I mean, he did get a 95 in the Florida Derby, which is pretty much in the mix of the top contenders. It's just not something that makes him a standout. And I think from a gambling standpoint, usually if you're going to take the favorite or a short price, you want a horse who's head and shoulders maybe above the competition, and I don't know that he is. He's certainly a win candidate, but I don't know that he's any more of a win candidate than several others in this field at the moment.
Well, switch gears now and head out towards the West Coast where you are, and a nice couple of wins coming into the Kentucky Derby for California's best hope, Tim Yachteen's Practical Move, who we spoke to earlier on this program. Your thoughts on the Santa Anita Derby win by Practical Move?
I really like the way this horse gets position and then finishes his races off. He's not a front runner, but he has good tactical speed. And I think that's a significant advantage in the Kentucky Derby, to not get shuffled back and to be in at least a striking position, forwardly placed. And he's able to do that. He got a good trip, but you make good trips by being a horse who's tactical, as opposed to having to rely on pace or weaving your way through traffic. So I think he's rock solid. He got a really good figure in that race of 100, and he's just really continued to progress through the winter from basically the time he won the Los Alamitos Futurity. He's just come back at 3 and continued to move forward off of that. So he's a rock solid candidate.
Now, just for a quick reference, we are recording this segment about a week before the draw of the Kentucky Derby on the 26th. So right now, and I want to ask you about the third place finisher in that race, who is the first horse out, Skinner. He would need one defection, but there is a week and change left until the Kentucky Derby, and defections are always possible. So should Skinner draw into the field of the Kentucky Derby? Your thoughts on him building on the effort that he had in the Santa Anita Derby?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about him, Jack, because he's a horse that I think is very interesting. I have a ton of respect for his trainer, John Sheriffs, who is really good at using prep races for what they are, preps, and using them as building blocks towards a major goal. We've seen him do it countless times over the years, most notably in this race with Giacomo. And to me, Skinner kind of has that same look. Not that he's as wild a long shot as Giacomo, but I think he's got the same look in terms of a horse who's been asked to make steady progress with the first Saturday in May being the ultimate goal. And I think whatever he's capable of doing, he will do on Derby Day, like you said, if he were to be fortunate enough to get into the race. But he's a very intriguing horse to me if he is able to get in.
We'll get to the second of three contenders for Todd Pletcher now in the Bluegrass winner, Tapit Trice. I'm curious your thoughts on his progression from the Tampa Bay Derby into the Bluegrass.
A significant step forward. He didn't really break well in the Tampa Bay Derby. He was more into the race, I thought, in the Bluegrass. But he is kind of a one-paced horse, big lumbering type of horse, and I think he needs to be outside of horses and in the clear. And I think the Derby draw is going to be very significant for him. I don't think he wants to be inside and among traffic in a 20-horse field. He drew inside in the Bluegrass, but he was able to work out, I thought, a pretty good trip getting outside by the time they got to the first turn and then staying out there. And I think that's where he wants to be eventually. It might help him if he were able to start from 10 or through post 10 through 15 or something like that, as opposed to 1, 2, or 3. But he did make a big step forward. I think he's going to continue to progress. I loved the first work that I saw of him post Bluegrass, the video of it, and he to me is just going from strength to strength. The draw being to me, I think the draw is usually overrated. I think it's significant in this horse's case.
And I want to also ask you about the runner-up Verifying in the Bluegrass. How do you think what do you think of his chances going into the Kentucky Derby?
One thing that's going to help him is that it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of pace in this race, and he's forwardly placed enough. But I thought he had every chance to beat Tapit Trice the way that race came up, and he couldn't do it. Now, maybe he's going to move forward off of that race, and certainly running Tapit Trice to a close finish makes him, if you like Tapit Trice, you certainly have to like him. I just thought he had as good a situation as possible in the Bluegrass in terms of being able to beat Tapit Trice, and he couldn't quite do it. But he's from a top barn as a top rider, and Brad Cox and Tyler Gaffleone respectively, and I certainly respect his chances. I like others better than him, but if he won, it wouldn't be something that would shock me.
We'll move on now to the final of the three charges of Todd Pletcher, who are in the body of the field right now. And the last time that I spoke with you on Racing Rundown, you mentioned that that King's Barnes was a horse that you were really looking forward to seeing when he got the opportunity to run in a Kentucky Derby prep. That came in the Louisiana Derby, and he won that race in fine fashion. Your thoughts on the win from King's Barnes in the Louisiana Derby?
Yeah, lightly raced horse, similar to what I was saying about Verifying. I just thought everything came up well for him, but it might again on Derby Day. But in the Louisiana Derby, there was really not much pace at all in the race, and he took advantage of it like you're supposed to. So I can't knock him. If he'd have lost that race with the setup that he had, that to me would have been a bigger knock. But I don't know that we've seen the ceiling of this horse. He's had so few starts that I think he's going to continue to improve. I just don't know that he's going to be able to get as soft a trip in the Derby as he did in the Louisiana Derby. But he's another horse in a field of, I think, a lot of fairly evenly matched horses. He's another horse who's certainly in with a chance.
And you actually bring up a point that we'll take a slight aside before moving on to some of the other regions. And there are a few horses that are rather lightly raced going into this Kentucky Derby that didn't start at 2, specifically King's Barnes is one of them. Is that something that concerns you? We did have until Justify won the Derby in 2018, we did have the long gap between winners of the Kentucky Derby among horses who hadn't started it too. Is that something that still concerns you for these lightly raced horses, or do you think that is an issue that's kind of receding as we go forward in years?
Yeah, I've not thought it's an issue. It's because even preceding Justify, it's just horses are trained differently now than they were 30 or 40 years ago. Well, I think you have to adjust as a handicapper to that fact. And so a horse who had 3 or 4 starts and didn't start at 2 in 1975 or 1985, you were at a much bigger disadvantage then. Horses ran more often, had more seasoning. That's just not the case now. And so I don't think let's put it this way, if Kingsbarns loses the Kentucky Derby, by my way of looking at it, it won't be because he didn't have enough experience or he hadn't run at 2. Those won't be reasons. It'll just be because he's not fast enough.
And we'll switch gears now and go down to Arkansas and talk about one of the horses that Brad Cox is bringing into the Kentucky Derby. And Angel of Empire rattled off a couple of nice stakes wins, including the Grade 1 Arkansas Derby. Your thoughts on Angel of Empire in this Kentucky Derby?
He's a horse that seems to have gotten a lot of steam lately. I'm not as bullish on him as I think a lot of others are. I thought the Arkansas Derby field was pretty soft as prep races go. His figure was a 94, which is in the mix, but kind of at the bottom end of the mix of the top contenders. Brad Cox is a terrific trainer, and Pratt's a great rider, so he's got excellent connections in his corner. If I was doing a graded handicap, I just wouldn't have him in my top 3 or 4. I understand why people like him based on the way he won. He looked like a nice colt, but I really question the quality of that field, and I just think he's going to end up being kind of a wise guy horse. And when horses start tumbling in odds as you get closer to a race because everybody is onto that horse, I want to run in the other direction.
And we'll also talk about another one of Brad Cox's charges, and that gives us the opportunity to also group in Lord Miles, the winner of the Wood Memorial. Do you see anything major coming out of the Wood Memorial from either of those 2 runners in that race?
Not really. I just thought, Lord Miles didn't really look like he had the credentials to be a top Derby horse until he won that race. The figure was just a 93. Hit Show didn't have a good post in that race, and I liked his previous race. So I think he's a decent colt. I just think he's maybe a cut below the top of this group, but I like him better than the winner. I just thought he had more to overcome that day. But the fact that there were several horses clumped together at the wire in a race that got a fairly mundane figure of just 93 makes me think that the Wood, as it has been for about 20 years now, is a race you want to fade.
And the last winner of a final prep that we have to talk about is the foreign contingent that will be coming into this race, and that's specifically the 2 Japanese horses, but major focus on the UAE Derby winner, Derma Sotogake. Do you have any thoughts on him going forward into the Kentucky Derby?
He's got speed, and he won nicely. I just think we've yet to see a UAE Derby winner be impactful in the Kentucky Derby, but the way these Japanese horses perform in all these international events, you've got to take him seriously. He won really nicely in the UAE Derby. His form coming in is good. He had to work the day that you and I are recording this. He had to work at Churchill Downs that I saw on video that was quite good. He made Continuar look like a $10,000 claimer the way he handled him in that work. So he's a horse that I think you have to take seriously. He's another one, though, that I think his odds might be lower than his chances. I think he's got a lot of steam behind him. And in a race where I think you've got a number of horses who could potentially win, you might not get as fair or square a price with this horse as you might on some others who fall through the cracks.
Couple more things that I'd like to discuss. I also want to ask you about Confidence Game, who's going to be coming into this Kentucky Derby off of a little bit of a layoff from his win in the Rebel, but Keith DeSormo has been a trainer who can be successful with these unorthodox methods. Your thoughts on Confidence Game in the Kentucky Derby?
I just think he's got a lot against him, not having he won't have run for more than 2 months. He needs some pace, I think, to run into. But I'm not sure he's going to get quite the same kind of pace that would set up his late run as well as it should. So I'm not too bullish on him at the moment.
And lastly, we talked a lot about some of the prep winners. We did mention a couple of the horses that ran underneath. Is there any other horses that had good non-winning efforts in final preps that you are interested in potentially giving a look in the Kentucky Derby?
I wouldn't say the final prep, but I really liked Disarm's race in the Louisiana Derby, chasing the no pace that was in there of King's Barnes. And I thought coming out of that, he was an intriguing horse for the Derby. He was light on points, so they had to run him back in the Lexington. And I thought he was just okay in the Lexington. But if that race was kind of a means to an end and they kind of just ran him in there to get enough points, but didn't really tighten the screws on him because he was coming back in 3 weeks and he was going to have to come back 3 weeks anew for the Derby, I liked his performance in the Louisiana Derby enough to use this horse in gimmicks, because I think he's going to be completely overlooked in the wagering and he offers a lot of value. So that would be the horse to me that would fall under that qualification of what you were asking.
All right. Well, we appreciate your time, Jay, and thank you for joining us again on WRHU.
Oh, my pleasure, Jack. Thanks for having me on again.
So we're joined once again by Richard Hoiles, race commentator for ITV Racing. I spoke with him before the 2000 Guineas, and I'm glad to be able to have an opportunity to speak with Richard again, especially given that it was a very fascinating running of the 2000 and the 1000 Guineas as well.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's nice to speak to you again as well. Yes, they didn't offer many clues for Epsom, I didn't think. It'll be interesting when we just chat it through. Normally you get a horse that finishes sort of fourth in either the 2000 or the 1000 and runs on strongly, and you think, yes, that was, the pipe opener for a classic later on. So the Guineas were interesting in their own right. If we deal with the 2000 first, well, first of all, we had the rather bizarre thing about a horse changing its name. Chaldean, as we had called him right the way through his 2-year-old career, became Chaldean at the request of Juddmonte, who actually had advised the wrong name last year. So we all changed to Chaldean, and the Chaldean form with Royal Scotsman from the Dewhurst last year was what stood out. They finished first and third. They were split by a big priced outsider. Auguste Rodin and Big Brown Bear, Little Big Bear, were both completely eclipsed. And the main surprise, I suppose, is that despite that, Auguste Rodin remains still very much towards the head of the Derby market. But it didn't go according to plan at all for Coolmore. First of all, they had to fly over a little earlier. Normally they fly over on the morning, but because of the restrictions around the King's coronation, they flew over the night before. And then Auguste Rodin was involved with some scrimmaging with Little Big Bear and also Royal Scotsman, and that resulted in Little Big Bear getting struck into. So he had a legitimate excuse. But it was hard to see what the excuse was for Auguste Rodin, to be honest. He was well beaten. His lines of form weren't held up either, the likes of Holloway Boy and the other horses that he ran up against in the Burton Futurity were slightly disappointing. So, yeah, it's a slightly lacklustre 2000 Guineas, if I'm absolutely honest. The winner and Royal Scotsman, Chaldean and Royal Scotsman, will stay around a mile, I'm sure. And the presence of 125 to 1 horse in second that hung halfway across the track, and the 150 to 1 horse in fourth place just makes it look a little shallow, maybe.
And that's actually the first thing that I was going to get to, and maybe you can, if you have anything further to add. But obviously with Chaldean, he is quite genuine given the efforts that he had when he was a 2-year-old, and as you mentioned, the form from the Dewhurst does stand up very well. But what does that reflect on the other horses that were backed in the markets? That it was, yes, Chaldean and Royal Scotsman who were 1-3 there, but they were split by, you mentioned the 125 to 1 outsider in second, the 150 to 1 outsider in fourth, Dubai Mile at 33 to 1 in fifth. What does that reflect on, the other horses? Obviously the 2 Coolmore horses, but Charlie Appleby's pair in there, Sakir for Roger Varian, those horses that were either single digits or around the teens in the markets.
I thought Noble Style and Sakir, well, Sakir in particular, shaped like a non-stayer. He got a little bit out of his ground. He did make a move. He didn't sustain it. There was always a question mark about Sakir because he showed so much natural speed at 2, particularly at Newbury, as to whether he would stay. I think he could be a Commonwealth Cup horse. Noble Style just gradually faded, but still struck me as a 7 furlong horse, and I wonder if Noble Style potentially could go for the Jersey at Royal Ascot, which would be slightly lowering his sights a little bit. The Gimcrack form is okay, actually, so I would be inclined to give those two a second chance over shorter distance. The puzzle of the race is what you do with August Rodin, because Little Big Bear had a genuine excuse. He fired up, he got struck into, he finished lame. August Rodin, that mile form, Epictetus had run okay and won at Epsom, but then that took a pummeling as well. The Epsom form in the classic trial, they're looking forward to the Guineas, to the Derby, has really taken a pasting. So I'm not sure. August Rodin's clearly priced on the potential Aidan O'Brien is talking about, rather than anything that we saw at Newmarket on that Saturday.
And, Little Big Bear obviously had the legitimate excuse. Do you think that might potentially come to affect him later in the season, or do you think once he's right physically, he'll be able to return to the form that we saw from him as a 2-year-old?
It's disappointing because he's going to have a second layoff, I'm sure. I don't know how, I haven't actually heard how severe a striking into it was, and hence it's how long it's going to keep him off the course. But given the travails that he had towards the end of his 2-year-old career, remember we didn't see him right towards the latter stages because of another setback he'd had, then that wasn't the return to action that they would have been anticipating. I wasn't overly worried about the trip. He just ran fresh. He just pulled hard. He jumped almost too well, really. And Wayne Lorden was fighting him, and then in doing so, he grabbed hold of his head, and the Royal Scotsman ran into the back of him and then shifted to the left and bumped August Rodin. So all in all, it was a race to forget for Coolmore. I would just have an open mind still on Little Big Bear. It's hard to know not so much ability he retains, but whether physically he will be able to show it as regularly as he did at the beginning of his 2-year-old career. But he obviously genuinely had excuses on the day.
And we'll switch gears over quickly to the 1,000 Guineas, because I want to ask you about Tahira and the runner-up there, and then obviously Maj. The form from the Curragh from last year stood up very well with how well Tahira ran, and Maj seemed like, this is 100% ex post facto, at least on my part. It always seemed like that Maj, who ran plenty of times at 6, was going to appreciate the step up and trip there. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the fillies from those top 2 from the 1,000 Guineas, and then potentially any other underneath runners.
So I think we got 2 good fillies. The clock backed up a good battle between Maj and Tahira. I think a lot of us allowed Maj to go under the radar because of the achievements that Maj had in Dubai, because we saw quite a bit of Maj, to be honest, as a 2-year-old, and it was pretty closely linked into the likes of Meditate and Lazoo. And so I sort of had those all in the same sort of category. And then she obviously pulled clear with Tahira, and the point about that race was the distance back to the third horse, which was 7.5 lengths, which is a long way, even allowing for ground being soft. And it wasn't really soft by then, it was more good to soft. So yeah, she sort of escaped under my radar. She'd won by 8.5 lengths over in Meydan, but it was only a sort of, they call them Guineas or fillies Guineas and what have you, but they're not very strong. And so I was surprised she pulled as far clear. Throughout the race, I thought Tahira was going to prove everything that we thought she was going to be. She travelled up. She'd missed the start slightly, but she travelled like the best horse, and I thought when she joined Maj that she was going to go away and win. You can say that maybe Dermot Weld had said, she might just be a gallop short. I just wasn't overly impressed with her, not so much attitude, in the sense she was just being lent into slightly, but she did just seem to hang fire a little bit and hang herself. She looked intimidated a bit by Maj, and that was a bit disappointing. So I would just have that slight question mark going forward about, in a battle, whether she will find as much as looks likely. But she's clearly got a good cruising speed. And a little like the 2,000 Guineas, in behind it's very difficult to make a case for too many. There was a remarkable run of the 5th place horse, Dance in the Grass. He was absolutely got lost at halfway and then made good late progress, but was 200 to 1. Matilda Bacosse is definitely going to be a sprinter. She did well to last as well as she did at a mile, but she was beaten 7.5 lengths. Carnarvon's pretty exposed. Meditate was another to disappoint that weekend for Aidan O'Brien. And then, you've got the likes of Lazoo, who, as I mentioned, was closely linked with Morge on some of their 2-year-old form. And reading down the field, the only one, I suppose, is Remarque, for whom it came very quickly. I might be inclined to give Remarque another chance. And Mama's Girl got ridden a little bit too forward by Kevin Stott, and it wouldn't surprise me if she drops back to 7 furlongs, maybe even a fast run 6. But again, the feature of the 2 Guineas was normally it whets the appetite for a market move for the Oaks or the Derby, and I don't think it did for either of those classics this time around. Morge and Tahira will stay around a mile, I'm pretty sure. Don't think they'll be stepping up in trip massively soon. We might go to 10 furlongs, but I don't think we'll be going anywhere else. I would imagine they could clash again in the Irish equivalent, because the 2 did look dominant on the day. So yes, I'm struggling a little bit to sort of offer up. It's made the Derby and Oaks picture quite interesting because the trials probably hold a little bit more weight than they might do.
And that's a good segue. I wanted to, before we talk about, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you at this point is so I could speak with you about the York trials. But just a general, from 30,000 feet question, we'll start with the Oaks and then go to the Derby. But just your thoughts on just some of the trial winners that we've seen over the course of the past 6 weeks in the spring, and if any of them you think are horses that you really fancy to move forward.
I think the 2 most interesting ones, let's start with the Oaks, because probably the trials, there've been a couple of trials on both, but let's start with the Oaks because the dominant trial was the performance of Save the Last Dance at Chester. In terms of impacting the market, she's no bigger than sort of 6-4 here at the moment. She won a race of reasonable quality by 22 lengths on admittedly very rain-softened ground, but in the years I've been calling, I do not remember a horse winning a race by that far as that, or a trial by that far. Now, the question then obviously becomes what you make of that and whether you can take it at face value. And the answer is you can't. I mean, the second horse gifted 6 lengths to the field from the stall, so you could knock 6 lengths off for that. The race itself was very shallow, and it also, crucially, I thought, there's a visual, if any of you have seen it, of off the home turn when, Save the Last Dance is sort of unleashed by Ryan Moore and seems to leave the field for dead. But I think the horse that she was gathering in, Sirona, looked like a non-stayer, and I think the 2 happened at the same time. The only thing that would then stop me saying that she's underpriced, she is underpriced, there's no doubt she's underpriced, but the only thing to say that she wouldn't win is the fact that her sectionals for the last 2 furlongs were quite quick. They were as faster than any of the sprinters on the same card. Now, sometimes that's just the distribution of energy, but she was strong at the finish. But I don't know, those wonderful performances that look almost too good to be true. Sometimes they can be. We saw one, Mum's Tipple here at York a few years ago. We saw, obviously, the horse that we were mentioning in the Guineas that disappointed. Mama's Girl, and that looked brilliant performance in the Nell Gwyn, and that didn't really stand up. So, look, she's interesting, but she was 20-1 when she won her maiden in April. It doesn't suggest that Aidan O'Brien had her top of the list, and anything that's on soft or heavy ground, all her wins are soft and heavy. This makes me think that might have been an overreaction from the market. The one I thought was interesting was Running Lion, who won at Newmarket over the Guineas weekend. It was a race that meant quite a lot because the sponsors are the owners, and it was Roaring Lion that had got the sponsors interested in racing in the first place, and so as a result, to win a race with Running Lion on Guineas weekend meant a great deal, and she won the Pretty Polly. I like the way she puts her head down. I really think she tries very, very hard. She'd done the same at Kempton. She has a will to win. She's a little bit more versatile. She's got form on the all-weather and soft ground. And I'd be more interested in her going forward. She's around about 10-1 than, say, the Last Dance at 6-4 on the trials that we've seen so far. We obviously do still have one big clue to come, and that's in the Lucidora at York tomorrow, where the second favourite anti-post, Infinite Cosmos, who comes from a family that Sir Michael Stout knows really well with the likes of Crystal Ocean, is amongst the field for the Musadora. It also features a couple of once raced and once victorious fillies as well. But I think of the trials, Running Lion is the one that I would take away from the fillies that's just left a lasting impression.
And just before we move on to the Derby, I do want to ask you specifically about Infant Cosmos, because she was another one that won on the Guineas weekend, going 1.25 miles at Newmarket. So how do you think she will step forward going to the Oaks? Obviously, she's the favorite right now for the Musadora and the second favorite in the anti-posts for Epsom. So is she one? I know you mentioned that Running Lion was the one that you really like, but is she one that you think could take a step forward towards Epsom?
Yes, absolutely. I think the drying ground might be in her favour as well. A lot of superstars progeny over here do tend to underperform on soft ground, and so I think it'll be the acid test. I mean, Sir Michael Stout's got an interesting couple of days because I think he's a traditionalist, and for him, the Musadora and the Dante, he's used the Dante as the stepping stone for many good horses. They haven't always gone on to the Derby. Crystallation would be a good example of that. Workforce got beaten when the bit slipped through the mouth, but then still ran in the Derby. But, you know, with the likes of Adder's Crown and what have you, you know that it's the trial that means most to him. And over the course of the next 2 days, he's got Infinite Cosmos, who steps up, markedly in class. That's why I can't yet put her in the same category as Running Lion, even though Running Lion is a longer price. And he has supplemented Passenger, who won the Wood Ditton over those 3 days at Newmarket, into the Dante, something he did with Crystallation a few years ago. The Dante is going to be a very interesting trial, I think, because of the fact that the Derby market in particular is very open because of the lack of progressive horses through the 2000 Guineas. We've had Military Order win the Lingfield Derby trial pretty well with Ad Arrest, who I did like, win at Chester, but he would probably want soft ground on the day, and I think he will be Frankie Dettori's last ride in his last Derby, and that'll add a bit of interest. But at the moment, the Dante's up for grabs. The horse that impressed me most individually was runs in the Dante is Canberra Legend, who also won at Newmarket, and I thought looked a nice horse, got lost going into the dip, and then picked up well. I think they might go for a flat track. Even if they win the Dante, I think they might end up going to France rather than Epsom. But I might be wrong. But Canberra Legend is the nicest horse I've seen, I think, going forward. I'm just not sure the track at Epsom will suit him based on what happened at Newmarket.
And given that the form for Epictetus, especially with how Auguste Rodin ran in the Guineas, has kind of been muddied. He's the favorite at 7-2 right now in the markets. How concerned are you? You did mention he did win the trial at Epsom, but how concerned are you for not just particularly for this race, but for him potentially going forward to the Derby?
Yeah, I can't have him at all. I really wouldn't have him favourite for the Dante, if I'm honest. I mean, Hadrianus and Seats Door both ran very poorly, as did Stormbuster. They all come out of that Epsom race. If you then translate that Epsom race backwards to Doncaster, Auguste Rodin, Epictetus splits Auguste Rodin and Holloway Boy, who on that day, if you may remember, hung badly right across the track and rather forfeited second place. There's nothing out of that appeals. I'm very surprised whether it's the Frankie factor, the Gosden factor, or whether there's just a slight absence of proven horses in the Dante. Epictetus was always going to France. There was never any chance of this horse going to Epsom. So I don't know whether they've changed their minds or whether they've, decided that, Epsom just comes back into calculations. He's won at Epsom. He's got a free entry off the back of it. But for me, I'm very, very surprised he's favourite. I'm right. If he wins on Thursday, I'm very wrong. I could see him missing the frame altogether, personally, just because of the lack of strength in his form lines. But others obviously see it differently because he is still favourite and in the market.
And I did also want to ask you about a couple of Charlie Appleby's runners. I know we mentioned a little bit about the Lingfield Derby trial. So wanted to ask you about your thoughts on Military Order and then Flying Honors, who is the second choice right now in the Dante at 4-1.
Yes, so Military Order is obviously interesting because of his relationship. He's a full brother to Adayar, and he did what Adayar didn't do, and he actually won the Lingfield Derby trial, although it was a rather different Lingfield Derby trial because it was run on the all-weather surface because the turf track was waterlogged, and that attracted quite a lot of negative publicity, saying, the reason is that Epsom's turf course resembles Lingfield's turf course resembles Epsom. You come down a hill, the camber, and you have a left-hand turn into the straight. The all-weather track's built significantly inside the turf course, so it doesn't really have the same configuration configuration. It's worth pointing out that there's only been one previous running of this where the same thing occurred, and they ran, I think it was 2008. But anyway, there was a horse called Main Sequence, who you'll know because he came over to the States after not really fulfilling the promise of running second in the Derby. But he ran in that Ringfield trial, and you could argue that if everybody else has been slogging their way around on heavy ground, that a Derby trial that's run on the all-weather surface is kinder in its preparation. He's only had 4 starts military order. He's gone off 4 to 5, 8 to 11, and evens twice. So he's an interesting horse. He's never won beyond listed company, but he currently shares favouritism. Depends where you look with Auguste Rodin. Now, Flying Honours, as you mentioned, is one of those horses that's going to line up in the Dante. At the moment, I would think it would take quite a performance to persuade William Buick that he doesn't want to be riding military order. Flying Honours still has a little bit more to prove, probably, in regards to the sort of the best quality. But, I mean, he's had 5 runs. He has been beaten twice. He was beaten by the Foxes, who's not the strongest horse. And he ran behind Epictetus in their maiden at Newmarket in July. As the Royal Lodge he beat. And he beat Blancheland in the Zetland, which is normally a race for sort of sluggers. But again, that hasn't worked out brilliantly either. So this is the problem with Dante. I keep coming back to Canberra Legend because I just don't like the front of the market much. And even if I want to be bullish and really say Epictetus can't win, which is my gut feeling if I'm honest, you've got to work out what you've got running for you, I suppose, if you want to take him on big time.
So I now have to circle back to Auguste Rodin, and is it possible that what happened at Newmarket was just too bad to be true, and Aidan O'Brien's expectations and discussions about him as a 2-year-old could potentially find their way back, or is that effort in the 2000 Guineas just that concerning that he has to be considered a horse that you can't put any factor into him winning at all? Because I know I was very puzzled by how poorly he ran there without really a genuine excuse for it, as you kind of alluded to earlier.
Yeah, that's my feeling. If he wasn't trained by Aidan O'Brien and talked up to the degree that he would have fallen like a stone out of the back of that market. And I think we mentioned this in our previous conversation, that the one thing about Coolmore is they are a commercial operation. So as a result, they will talk up all their horses until the form says that they can't be talking them up anymore. And the benefit for Auguste Rodin is he comes from a different form line, if you like, in terms of sires. He's not a Galileo. He's not a No Nay Never. So as a result, anything that they can get from a different sire, I remember they bought in Wootton Bassett to try and refresh some of those form lines, because Galileo had been so fantastically successful that virtually every stallion they were getting had Galileo plastered all over its page. Whereas being by Deep Impact, Auguste Rodin, like Saxon Warrior, potentially would open up new avenues. So there's always a question as to whether that was the reason he's being talked up. Obviously, he comes out of Rhododendron, who was an absolutely fantastic horse. She was a real top-class performer. And she won, actually, a race that we got at the weekend called the Lockinge in 2018. And she really, so there was every reason to talk him up as a potential sire. I don't know, if you've been caught bluffing once, I'm not sure I'd go all in without seeing that there was a genuine excuse. And I don't know what else Aidan's got to run, which is also interesting. He normally goes there with 4 or 5 towards the top of the market. He hasn't got that this time. So, maybe you just continue to talk them up and hope that whatever was wrong gets put right. The problem is I couldn't see what went wrong.
And the last thing that I'll ask you about, specifically both both Epsom Classics, but maybe more so to the Derby. Is there any outsider right now that we haven't talked about, or just really towards the bottom of the market, that you think is potentially one that, whether or not they're going to run in a trial or not, would have end up in the Derby or the Derby in the Oaks and potentially not necessarily win the Derby? But we've seen a lot of outsiders run very strong races underneath in Epsom. So is there anyone right now that might potentially fit that bill towards you in either of those races towards the bottom of the market?
The Derby still has a very, very large entry because we've still got to get down to the sort of filling them out. So I suppose, also, if he I don't really know what's happened to him because we haven't seen him for a while. But if you looked at the bare achievements of horses at 2, then Al Rifa, who we haven't seen, has only run 3 times. We haven't seen the horse in September 2022, but won the national stakes over 7 furlongs, and that was a Group 1 for Joseph O'Brien. The dam sire on that side is Galileo. Love on my mind as the dam, and Wooden Bassett the sire. So there is a question mark as to whether he would stay. Wooden Bassett's not quite as big an influence for stamina that obviously the Galileos are. But if he made it to the day, then I might think he might be capable of something better just because his 2-year-old form was good, and I just don't see what else has come out of the woodwork. The other one I suppose we should mention is the one I briefly mentioned in the Dante Passenger being supplemented. I was told that Michael Stout wanted to run him at Ascot in the King Edward VII and is going to take in another small race. But the reason he is in the trial is because Ryan Moore was very keen that he was put in a trial. He was put in the D stakes and taken out because of the very soft ground. And Richard Kingscote is riding because Ryan would almost certainly be claimed on Derby Day. So Richard Kingscote, as a result, having a getting to know you with Passenger. So those two, I suppose, 20-1 and 40-1. But you've got to wait for Al Rifa to be there on the day because it may well be he just drops out at the next stage. I haven't heard anything about him for a little while.
All right, well, we appreciate, as always, getting the opportunity to have a conversation with you, Richard, and hopefully, even though it is a little bit murky right now, it seems like it will be a very interesting weekend at Epsom because there will be a lot of questions that will be answered.
Yeah, sometimes it's interesting, isn't it? You can have a quality horse that is a great Derby winner, and you'll have the same with, your Triple Crown over there. But sometimes the better racing in terms of competitiveness are when there isn't a great horse standing out at the moment. I think further down the line, I think the likes of Canberra Legend and Arrest will prove themselves as horses that you can follow during the course of the 3-year-old season, and probably Arrest at the moment would be where I'd land on the Derby. And Canberra Legend I would land on as being a potential horse for the big 3-year-old clashes against older horses on flat tracks later on in the year. But yes, at the moment, the unknown factor is very great for both classics, and that doesn't make it a bad thing sometimes.
All right, well, thank you for the conversation, and we will speak to you again sometime soon enough, Richard. Thank you once again.
No problem, John. All the very best.
Well, hello and welcome to Racing Rundown. My name is Jack Sargent. We're going to be previewing the 155th Belmont Stakes for you today, to be contested at Belmont Park over 1.5 miles on Saturday, June 10th. 9 horses in this field, headlined by the winner of the Preakness Stakes from 3 weeks ago, National Treasure, and the 2022 champion 2-year-old Forte. We got 7 other horses to talk about in addition to those 2. We're going to go from 1 to 9 in terms of post position for these horses, and that means we'll start with the number 1, Tappet Shoes. As you can tell by the name, he is a son of Tappet. We got 6 of these 9 horses in this field that are related to Tappet. 3 of them with Tappet as their sire. The other 3, Tappet as their maternal grandsire. And Tappet Shoes is probably the least likely of the 9 horses in this field to win this race. That's actually all that Tappet Shoes really has going for him, being a son of Tappet. Just a quick aside, Tappet has had such an impact on the Belmont Stakes. He sired 4 Belmont Stakes winners and has been a part of so many really strong runners. He was the sire of last year's Belmont Stakes runner-up Nest. Most recently sired Essential Quality, who won the Belmont Stakes 2 years ago in 2021. So that's where the accolades for Tappet come in here. As for Tappet Shoes has just 1 win in his career, and that was a maiden race back at the fairgrounds as a 2-year-old on December 3rd, 2022, going 1 mile and a 16th. He did win that race, going away very decisively, but since then, only 1 start in stakes company, and that was in a race called the Bathhouse Row at Oaklawn on April 22nd, going 1 mile and an 1/8. He was beaten by Red Row 1 in that race, who's also here in this Belmont Stakes. He drew the outside post, so he'll be the last horse that we talk about. But Tappet Shoes got run down by Red Row 1, going 1 mile and an 1/8 in that race. He was beaten ahead in that spot, and really, even though he is a son of Tappet, you look at the dam side, which is where a lot of Belmont Stakes, especially pedigree-wise, chances come from. A son of Awesome Flower, who was a stakes-winning mare, a daughter of Flower Alley, as I said, stakes-winning mare, but did most of her running around 7 furlongs to a mile and a 16th. Not a horse that was a real standout going this type of trip. And Tapit Shoes stepping up to the 1.5 miles for the first time in his career, as is everybody else in this race, doesn't have a whole lot going for him. Again, only one race in Stakes Company. That was a runner-up effort in that Bathhouse Row that I already alluded to. He pales in terms of class, experience, and when I say experience, I mean in terms of stakes runs, just a lack of wins overall. Tapit Shoes is the second longest shot in this race on the morning line, and deservedly so. Tapit Shoes doesn't have a lot going for him in this spot, so we'll pass on him in this race. Move on to number 2, Tapit Trice, also a son of Tapit, a lot more fancied in this race than Tapit Shoes is. It's easy to mix up these Tapits in this spot. Tapit Trice comes into this Belmont Stakes after a 7th place effort in the Kentucky Derby, a lot more disappointing than I was expecting, myself and a lot of other people were expecting from this lad. Tapit Trice was a horse coming into the Kentucky Derby, looked a lot like Essential Quality did a couple years ago, looked a lot like Todd Pletcher's Belmont Stakes winner from a year ago, Mo Donegal as well. Tapit Trice, typical, Todd Pletcher horse in the lead up to the Kentucky Derby, does not do it very prettily, but he gets it done. And that was the thing about his Bluegrass Stakes. It was a very workmanlike Bluegrass victory. Didn't get a huge figure to its name. I thought he looked a lot like Essential Quality did in winning that Bluegrass Stakes in 2021. Tapit Trice did on April 8th, winning that Bluegrass Stakes. But that Kentucky Derby from 5 weeks ago was a race that was absolutely shapen up for Tapit Trice to be able to make his kind of an impact in there. Dead closer. And the question about Tapit Trice going in, was he going to get the pace that he needed to run into? Well, he got that pace that he would have needed if he had the talent to win the Kentucky Derby. We'll go through that pace again. 1:10 flat for 3/4, 45 and 3 for a half mile in that race. They were burning it down the backside, and you saw horses come from about the area where Tapit Trice was in that race. Mage came from 16th at the half mile pole. Angel of Empire, 15th at the half mile pole. Disarm was 12th at the half mile pole, just to mention that for him as well. The pace was there for Tapit Trice to close into. Problem with him was very wide on the turn, did have a little bit of trouble, had to check slightly, but the pace was there for him to close into. And I was very disappointed by his effort in the Kentucky Derby, because I didn't expect him to win the Kentucky Derby. I thought that he was going to run a race very similar to the way that Mo Donegal ran last year. Going into the Kentucky Derby, I thought that this was I wasn't anointing this horse the Belmont Stakes winner the way that I was anointing Mo Donegal, basically the Belmont Stakes winner a year ago going into the 2022 Kentucky Derby. But I thought with the way that the run could shape up for Tapit Trice, he would place himself on a really good trajectory to win the Belmont Stakes, provided how he ran at Churchill Downs, and he didn't really do that. 7th place, as I said, with that pace to close into. And as I said, he was in the area where horses that finished 1st and 3rd, Mage and Angel of Empire, did. You used that pace to close into, and Tapit Trice just was not able to do that. So I don't like him coming into this Belmont Stakes based off of that Kentucky Derby run. I thought it was very disappointing for him. He got the circumstances of the race to play out the way that they needed to play out for him to be able to win. He just couldn't get the job done. So Tapit Trice, off him going into this Belmont Stakes. We'll move on to one of the new shooters in this race now. Number 3, Archangelo, winner of the Peter Pan, the traditional local prep at Belmont Park. And this is a race that I've had a love-hate relationship with, the Peter Pan, in terms of prepping horses for the Belmont Stakes. 2 winners of the Peter Pan have won the Belmont Stakes since 1990, AP Indy and Tonalist in 1992 and 2014, respectively. The Peter Pan in general has produced 5 and an asterisk 6 Belmont Stakes winners, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So 5 horses that have run in the Peter Pan have won the Belmont Stakes. AP Indy and Tonalist already mentioned them. Colonial Affair, second in 1993 in the Peter Pan, won the Belmont Stakes. Lemon Drop Kid, third in the Peter Pan in 1999, won the Belmont Stakes. Sir Winston, most recently in 2019, the most recent horse to win this race. To run in this race and win the Belmont Stakes, was second in there. Also, I mentioned there was the asterisk, have to mention 2010, Drosselmeyer. He was second in the Dwyer, which is another one of those early spring races at Belmont Park. That was run in place of the Peter Pan in 2010 at the same conditions, 1 1/8 miles, the same configuration as that Peter Pan was. Drosselmeyer was second in there, siphoned that into a Belmont Stakes win. But that's 6 races, 6 horses in 30 plus years of sample size, and I go all the way back to 1990, and you can go even further than that. The sample size that I pulled from was 1990, and if you want to go back a year earlier, Easy Goer did not run in the Peter Pan. The Peter Pan winner, or any horses from the Peter Pan, did not win the Belmont Stakes in 1989 or 1988 or 1987. You get the idea. Love-hate relationship with this race. Arcangelo, though, we'll talk about his merits. Very lightly raced horse coming into this Belmont Stakes. It took him a couple races to figure himself out. Got his maiden-breaking win in his 3rd career start. Kind of toss out his first run of his career. That was going 6 furlongs at Gulfstream. This is a horse, all you have to do is look at his pedigree. He's a son of Arrogate, son of the late Arrogate, out of a Tappet mare. This is a horse that does not want to be sprinting. So you can toss out that first race. Maybe that was just a race to get him to the track and get something underneath him. I still want to toss out his 2nd career effort. That was going a 1-turn mile at Gulfstream Park. Now, he was beaten by Kings Barnes, who was well fancied in the Kentucky Derby and won the Louisiana Derby earlier this spring in that spot. So it was a quality maiden race in terms of the winner. There's not really a whole lot of other horses underneath from that race that really pop out to you and say, okay, this was a salty maiden race aside from that winner. But Arcangelo was making up a little bit of ground. The one thing that's odd about that maiden race, which, again, why I'm not putting a whole lot of stock into it, there were horses that were further back than he was that closed into it, and it wasn't like there was a very fast pace in that race that he was close to. He was 7th at the the first quarter in that race, and the runner-up and 3rd place finishers were 10th and 8th respectively in that race at that same spot. So Arcangelo's 2nd race, another one that you can kind of look past. Broke his maiden on March 18th at Gulfstream Park, also going a 1-turn mile, but that was a much better race. Kind of seemed like that he had a couple of races underneath him, and Jenna Antonucci, his trainer, seemed to figure him out by that point. And sometimes with horses, that's what you need, just to get a couple runs underneath them. Definitely the 6 furlong run, absolutely something to just get a run into him. But I also want to say that 2nd race of his career also fits into that category. 2-month break, essentially 2-month break going into that Peter Pan Stakes. Not a whole lot of quality in that race. There was one horse that I thought with a potential solid run in the Peter Pan would be a big threat to hit the board in this Belmont Stakes, and that's another Todd Pletcher runner by the name of Classic Catch. Classic Catch didn't really materialize in that Peter Pan, but the way that Arcangelo ran there, and again, that was going 1.8 miles, the Peter Pan. This is a 1.5 mile race, and I told you about that pedigree already. Arrogate did great running at 1.25 miles. Three of Arrogate's 4 best races, all at 1.25 miles. Never did go 1.5 miles, did Arrogate, but 3 of his best races were going 1.25 miles, and that's beyond that, I should say, is what Arcangelo is going to do. I already told you about Tappet earlier in this preview. So this is a horse that's going to want to run for days. And he only won that Peter Pan by a head. He was getting up towards the end of that race, trying to beat Bishop's Bay, who was close to the front. Wasn't in front for the entire race, but was pretty close to the horse who was setting the pace for the majority of that Peter Pan. Was only in front took the lead by a head in mid-stretch and held it there for the entire race. Now, You can criticize him a little bit on that and say, okay, well, he wasn't really putting away Bishop's Bay, the runner-up in that spot. But you can also take the flip side and say, well, he's getting more distance in this race. So that might give him an opportunity to win by more, having an extra couple of furlongs in this race. 9 furlongs, I should say an extra few furlongs. 9 furlongs in that race, 12 furlongs this upcoming Saturday. I'm not sure how I feel about him because I think he's just a little bit too inexperienced. But there's a lot to like about him because this is clearly a horse that's improving with every start. Improved from race 2 to race 3 into that maiden. Improved from the maiden breaking effort into the Peter Pan. This is a horse that's going to run credibly in this Belmont Stakes. I just think he's a little bit too lightly experienced when you consider that you have horses in this race like Angel of Empire, like Hit Show, like Forte, who are much more seasoned than he is. I think this is a horse for the summer, but it's a little bit too early for him. And now we'll move on to number 4 in this race, and that is the Preakness winner, National Treasure. Won an extraordinarily weak rendition of the Preakness Stakes, and it would be so easy for me to just toss out National Treasure purely based on merits. Again, I can't underscore how bad the field was in that 2023 Preakness Stakes. Only beating Blazing Sevens by a head is an indictment on two things: the quality of the field, also an indictment on the talent of the individual horse himself. That being said, you can't dismiss National Treasure 100% in this spot, because National Treasure has one thing in this race that not many other horses in this spot do, and that's speed. And the Belmont Stakes is a very weird race in terms of the way that dynamics shake out. You would think, with the way that the Kentucky Derby is usually run, you have these closers coming late in the Derby, you would think, okay, well, the Belmont Stakes is automatically a closer race because you're giving them more ground. That's not necessarily the case. Being towards the front has traditionally been the place to be in the Belmont Stakes. American Pharoah is the most recent horse to win the Belmont Stakes wire to wire. That's what National Treasure is going to try to do. Now, National Treasure is nowhere near the American Pharoah pantheon. But the point is that you want to be towards the front in the Belmont Stakes. And National Treasure is legitimately the only horse in this race with speed. So what National Treasure and John Velasquez are going to try to do in this race is they're going to try to go out to the front and take them all the way really, really slow. The only horse that's really going to accompany him is, that really, I should say, could accompany him, is Tappet Shoes, but I don't really project Tappet Shoes to be much of a threat for National Treasure. And National Treasure can just go out there and try to walk them the whole way and get away, potentially steal this Belmont Stakes going 113, 114. If you see a 3/4 of a mile in this Belmont Stakes in 113 and 3+, that's a danger territory for these horses like National Treasure, like like Hit Show, like Angel of Empire, like Forte, because that means that National Treasure is getting away with very easy fractions, and John Velasquez is probably getting an opportunity down the backside about halfway through the Belmont Stakes to give National Treasure a breather, and he could potentially have that second run there. However, I'm slightly dubious on him being able to take it the whole length of this, because we saw this a year ago. A lot of people liked We the People, who was the pace setter in the Belmont Stakes last year. And the thing about We the People was, well, he's going to be lone speed in this race, and towards the front is the place to be. And that was absolutely sound logic, because that's what We the People did in the Belmont Stakes. However, it's that last half mile in this race, I should say it's that last quarter mile from the 1.25 mile pull through to the finish line, which got to We the People. We the People led for 1.25 miles in the Belmont Stakes, but you saw that final quarter, the two horses that had the pedigree and had the stamina coming into the race to get the 1.5 mile trip were the horses that finished 1-2, Mo Donegal and Nest. So National Treasure is a threat in this Belmont Stakes because of tactics. National Treasure is not a threat in this Belmont Stakes because of talent or because of past success. That Preakness was only his second win of his career. Now, he had a lot of seconds and thirds in stakes races, was third in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. in 2022 at Keeneland, but there wasn't a whole lot of talent underneath National Treasure in that Breeders' Cup Juvenile. And National Treasure ran in a couple of races in California, the American Pharoah and the Sham, which were very not deep races. Went to and I should also say the Santa Anita Derby as well. So 3 races in California. 1 as a 2-year-old, 2 as a 3-year-old. Not a lot of deep, not very deep, especially towards the bottom, and not a lot of talent in there. National Treasure, threat based on race tactics, not a threat based on talent. We'll move on now to horse number 5 in this race. Il Miracolo is danced a lot of dances. I got to give this horse credit because he's run a lot for a 3-year-old in 2023. You don't see as many starts that this horse has coming into this Belmont Stakes that he has. He's got 9 races coming into this Belmont Stakes, and he's running a lot of stakes races. Ran in the Remsen, ran in all 4 Kentucky Derby preps down at Gulfstream, and then an allowance race, which is the win that he has coming into this Belmont Stakes. However, all you have to do is just look at the stakes efforts. 3 6th-place finishes in the Florida Derby Fountain of Youth Remsen, a 5th in the Holy Bull, and a 7th in the Mucho Macho Man, and that was an exceptionally weak Mucho Macho Man, and not a whole lot of talent in that Remsen either. And really, if we're being completely honest, outside of Forte and Mage, the bottom of the bottom of the Fountain of Youth and the bottom of the Florida Derby leaves a lot to be desired. Il Miracolo doesn't have that. He's danced in a lot of races, and he's been finishing on the board type of quality that some of these new shooters in the Belmont Stakes do. He doesn't have that. He's just been an off-the-board runner consistently in all these stakes races. Antonio Sano's a trainer that likes to enter horses to be there for the party, I guess is what you could say. It was what you could describe that, and that's what Il Miracolo is in this race. Doesn't provide a lot of depth. He's another horse in this race, but doesn't provide a lot in terms of consistency, talent. There's not the angle of, okay, well, you're giving him a 1.5 miles, and he was running at a mile and a 16th, 1 1/8. So that extra 3.5, 4 furlongs is going to do wonders for him. That's not really there with Il Miracolo. He is a son of gun runner out of Tappet, so the trip certainly, the step up in trip certainly isn't going to hurt him. But I don't know that it's going to do anything in terms of helping him move forward because the quality with him is not there. And now we're going to move on to the post-time favorite. A lot of drama surrounding Forte across these last 5+ weeks. Won the Florida Derby in very, I guess you could say, stop your heart action if you had Forte, especially if you were playing multi-race wagers and you were kind of banking on Forte to try to carry you through. Maybe gave you a little bit of a scare at mid-stretch when it looked like he was going to get beat in the Florida Derby. And it's insane to think that he has not run since that Florida Derby, of course. Scratched the morning of the Kentucky Derby, and because of that was not able to run in the Preakness Stakes. Comes here, and credit to Todd Pletcher. I will say credit to Todd Pletcher for running him in a Triple Crown race, because it would have been really unfortunate if the champion 2-year-old from a year ago did not end up running in a Triple Crown race. I don't think that this is the ideal circumstance for Forte going 1.5 miles in the Belmont Stakes, but this is a horse that's got plenty of talent, and there's no reason to sit on him and just wait for something like the Jim Dandy or the Haskell and races in the summer. So credit to Todd Pletcher for bringing him here. Now, why do I say that the 1.5 miles and this Belmont Stakes is not a great option for Forte? Well, it's once again you talk about the pedigree. He is a son of Violence, and Violence is traditionally a sprinter sire, and that's been the question about Forte ever since he started to come on this Kentucky Derby trail. How far is he going to want to go? And you even look at his mother, Queen Caroline, who is a mare by the Breeders' Cup Classic winning sire, Blame. Now, that doesn't really play into my narrative of the 1.5 miles not perfect for him, because Blame was a winner of a Breeders' Cup Classic. But this is a mare, Queen Caroline, that did most of her running, number 1 on turf, but number 2 around the 1 mile to 1 16th, 1 1/8 range. So does not jump off the paper as a mare that really sells distance and Violence. I already talked about that. One of the best sprinter sires in this country. That being said, Forte is just a really solid racehorse. Only lost 1 race in his career, and that was in the Sanford back at Saratoga in July of 2022 on a very deep, tiring racetrack where Forte found himself towards the back of the pack, was never really able to get himself involved. He doesn't want to be that far back in races. So that's kind of a race that you can just toss out his his Sanford effort from the second career start that he had. Then he ran in the Hopeful. Then he ran in the Breeders' Futurity, and he was a lot closer in both of those races, the Hopeful and the Breeders' Futurity. Now, the Hopeful was a race where there was not a lot of depth in it. Only 6 horses in that Hopeful Stakes, a much deeper field, 14 in the Breeders' Futurity, but you saw the quality from Forte, and Forte went into the Breeders' Cup Juvenile last year as the clear second best, the clear second best on paper behind Cave Rock, who's the really well-fancied Bob Baffert runner from California, and Forte once again sat much closer in that race. Forte is a mid-pack type of horse. Now, what is that going to do for him in the Belmont Stakes? Well, the Belmont Stakes has been a race where I talked about the benefits of being on the lead in the Belmont Stakes, but where the winners of the Belmont Stakes come from, and the overwhelming majority of winners come from this spot. It's horses who sit a second flight trip, a lot of times outside of horses, about a length and a half off of a leader. And if Forte sits that kind of trip in the Belmont Stakes, he is going to be in prime position to be able to win this race, because that's where so many Belmont Stakes winners have come from. Mo Donegal came from that spot. Taprit, Todd Pletcher's most recent prior to Mo Donegal Belmont Stakes winner, came from that trip. Tonalist came from that trip. I can go on and on about horses that came from the trip that I think Forte is going to sit in this Belmont Stakes. The question is, he's been off for 2+ months. He was ready to go for the Kentucky Derby and then didn't get to run in that race, and has kind of been on and off since then in terms of his training schedule, workout, stuff like that. That's a question. There's a lot of drama surrounding Forte in terms of also the circumstances of him not running in the Kentucky Derby, but how much of a toll has that taken on Forte? I don't know the answer to that question. I also don't know if Forte is going to get this race's trip. So Forte is a horse, I'm going to let him beat me in this spot. He's got a lot of talent. I respect him. But I think 1.5 miles is just a touch too far for him. I thought 1.25 miles was perfect going for him in the Kentucky Derby. I think 1.25 miles is perfect for him going forward. But I think that's his upper limit, and there's been horses, we the people, tis the law among them, that have run in Belmont Stakes. Now, I should say about tis the law, did not run in 1.5 miles Belmont Stakes, but I think 1.25 miles upper limit for tis the law, 1.25 miles definitely an upper limit for we the people, and you saw that based on the way that he ran in 2022. Next is number 7, Hit Show. This is a horse that I thought ran a revelation of a race in the Kentucky Derby. A lot closer than I expected him to be. And by the way, a massive step up for him from what was a very disappointing effort in the Wood Memorial, because he lost to the 59-1 long shot Lord Miles, who had only won the Macho Man coming into that Wood Memorial. And I thought that was a real step down for Hit Show. Hit Show was a horse that prior to the Wood Memorial was a horse that I really thought, this is a race the Belmont Stakes really love him for, because he's a son of Candy Ride out of a Tappet mare, and he's just built like a horse that is going to improve, stepping up in trip to the 1.5 miles. He ran like a horse that will love 1.5 miles in the Withers. Didn't run like that in the Wood Memorial, however. So I was never seriously considering picking him to win the Kentucky Derby, but he was a horse that I thought, okay, Belmont Stakes comes around, this is a horse to really take seriously. Backed off of that after the Wood Memorial. However, the Kentucky Derby, I talked about that pace that he sat, I talked about that pace in the Kentucky Derby. He sat really close to it, ended up finishing 5th in the Kentucky Derby while being 6th at the 3/4 pole. Once again, 3/4 in 110 flat. That's flying in the Kentucky Derby, especially these days. And we had a couple of Kentucky Derbies that blew up from the pace perspective, but you go back 2021, 2020, those 2 Kentucky Derbies were merry-go-rounds. Speed was carrying like nothing, nobody's business. And you even go back further where it was difficult to close in the Kentucky Derby because there wasn't a lot of really fast paces, but it was easy to hang around. And if that pace had been 3/4 in, let's say, 111, 112, then okay, you attribute it to He was close to a slow pace, kind of hung around there. Hit Show, though, I'm kind of back to where I was with him after he won the Withers. This is a horse that's definitely going to improve with the 1.5 miles. And if he can sit that kind of trip that he sat at Churchill Downs, and I just talked about that trip with Forte, I like Forte if he gets that trip. I love Hit Show if he gets the trip that Forte, that I projected for Forte. If he sits that Mo Donegal, that Nest, that Tappert trip, plus this pedigree, this is a horse that is a real massive threat for this Belmont Stakes. I love Hit Show for those reasons. I thought his Kentucky Derby run was a revelation of a Kentucky Derby run. I think he's going to get this trip, and I think he's going to sit the trip that he needs to sit in order to win this Belmont Stakes. So that's Hit Show. Number 8 is the post-time favorite for the Kentucky Derby, Angel of Empire, third there. Brad Cox has a lot of Todd Pletcher to him. He's doing this with Hit Show, and he's doing this with Angel of Empire. This run in the Kentucky Derby, rest him up 5 weeks to the Belmont Stakes. Todd Pletcher, the best in the business at doing that. Brad Cox is trying to accompany Todd Pletcher in that fashion. Brad Cox won this race 2 years ago with Essential Quality, doing what he is doing with Hit Show and Angel of Empire. Angel of Empire was a horse who didn't love in the early portion of the year, didn't love his Risen Star as well. He won the Risen Star as a 13-1 long shot over a field which was very and I just didn't really buy him going into the Arkansas Derby, and he kind of shut me up in that Arkansas Derby. You had to take him seriously in the Kentucky Derby, and he ran third there. Very credible effort for him in that Kentucky Derby. Here's the thing that I don't like about Angel of Empire that I compare to when I compare him to a horse like Hit Show. Angel of Empire is going to be closing from much deeper in this Belmont Stakes, and I already talked about how there is not a whole lot of speed in this Belmont Stakes. It's National Treasure, maybe a little bit of Tappet Shoes, but that's about it. Angel of Empire needs to be in contention at the quarter pole if he's going to have a shot to win this Belmont Stakes. Angel of Empire was 16th of 18 horses down the backside in the Kentucky Derby. And that was very beneficial for Angel of Empire because the pace in the Kentucky Derby was as fast as it was. He's not going to get 3/4 in 110 flat to close into. So you have to be closer in the Belmont Stakes in a race that is almost always slower than the early portions of the Kentucky Derby is. And for a horse that's a deep closer like Angel of Empire, again, you look at it at face value, a horse that was running out of ground in the Kentucky Derby, well, just give him an extra 1/4 mile. That solves the problem. Not necessarily the case with the Belmont Stakes. So Angel of Empire is a horse that I'm going to fade for those couple of reasons. I've never been in love with his talent, but I just don't like the trip that he's going to sit in respect to the fractions that they're going to run in this Belmont Stakes. I don't think they're going to go fast enough for him to be able to come pick him up late in this Belmont Stakes. And the final horse that we're going to talk about has that same problem, Red Route 1, a winner of that Bathhouse Row that I referenced earlier with Tappet Shoes, absolute dead closer. He was 4th in the Preakness, coming from next to last in there. And the only reason he was coming from next to last was because there was a horse named Chase the Chaos who came out from California, was somehow 10-1 in that race. And I say somehow 10-1 because of how short that Preakness field was. But somebody had to finish 4th in that Preakness, and that somebody was, in fact, Red Route 1. But Red Route 1 is going to be coming from so far behind in this Belmont Stakes. He's going to appreciate the step up in trip, but here's the problem. He's going to be so far back that and they're going to be going slow enough that nobody's going to be coming back to him. Red Route 1 is the type of horse that would win a Belmont Stakes if there was an absolute nuclear reactor pace meltdown. Good news for all the other horses in this spot, and bad news for Red Route 1. There's not going to be a nuclear reactor level pace meltdown in this Belmont Stakes. So Red Route 1 will be coming late. But Red Route 1 is going to be coming late when there's not going to be 6 horses in front of him stopping and coming back to him so that he can get up to finish 3rd in there. At the right price, if you're projecting a absolute nuclear reactor pace meltdown, possibly. That's not going to be there, though. So Red Route 1, I'm off of him in this race. I don't think he's got a shot to win this. I don't love... He's relatively consistent, 2nd in the Southwest, 2nd in the Rebel, 4th in the Preakness, as I said, but those are all races where he had favorable circumstances in. He's not going to have favorable circumstances in this Belmont Stakes. So where do you go? I say Hit Show. I like the trip that Hit Show is going to sit. I think if he sits that second flight, maybe length and a half, 2 lengths off of National Treasure, ideally 3 wide outside of horses so that he doesn't have to risk getting bottled up. Although that being said, the bottled up concern notwithstanding, there's 9 horses in this race, and I don't think there's going to be a rush to get up there and contend with National Treasure, the projected pace setter. So I think that it could work out well for Hit Show. I think he works out the trip. I think he's the winner of this Belmont Stakes. Thank you for tuning in to Racing Rundown for this Belmont Stakes preview. We'll see you next time when we break down how this race was run after the 155th Belmont Stakes. We'll see you then. Have a good one. So I'm joined now by Dave Grening, and the New York correspondent for the Daily Racing Form. Dave, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Racing Rundown. I have been able to be part of a couple of shows with you through my time with WRHU, but I am excited to be able to have you on Racing Rundown and discuss with you what I think is, at least personally, a very compelling Travers this year.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and I agree with you. I think it's a short field, but a good field. So, just we'll start just with the general thing. Right now, the 7 probables at this point, expected entries. Just your general thought on the group that is expected to line up for the Travers this Saturday, and then we'll get into some specifics on the several horses that are especially compelling this year. Well, I think with this group, it's fairly an inexperienced group, 6 starts or less, most of them except for Forte. I think these are horses that you might even see, hopefully we'll see them as 4-year-olds, and maybe we'll be talking about them in the Whitney next year, because I think they're just sort of scratching the surface. I'm hoping, or anyway, they're scratching the surface on how good they can be, even though we have the 3 winners of the Triple Crown races. I think that's just the beginning for them. I think these horses have the potential to be even better going forward, and with a little development and maturity, can be good 4-year-olds next year.
And that actually brings up something that I didn't even think about. You mentioned the relative inexperience of several of the horses in this group, and does that play into favor for, at least in your opinion, for any of the horses who might have more seasoning? And what does that say for some of the horses that are coming into this race with less runs underneath them than you may have seen from horses coming into the Travers 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, I think what's happening is, if you're trying to make the Derby and you don't get there, you just sort of back off a little bit and then look for the summer races. So that might play into some of these horses that have 6 or less starts. In the case of like a Forte, it's kind of admirable that he started in May of his 2-year-old year, and he's still going strong here in August of his 3-year-old season. You don't always see that. He's never run a bad race. The one time he was 4th, it was actually his 2nd start of his career on a very deep track here in Saratoga. But since then, he's pretty much won first or second every time. A horse like Archangelo, who just sort of emerged in the spring with those wins in the Peter Pan and Belmont, I think he's the type of horse that, with experience, right now he's a talented, sort of raw individual who is being honed into and developed into a very good racehorse. So I think even his connections will be better at 4. In fact, traveling the barns this morning, I got the same exact quote from the trainer of Archangelo as I did the trainer of Mage about their respective horses, that we haven't seen the best of them yet. The best is yet to come, and you hope that they stay sound and healthy enough that we do see that. As far as it pertains to this particular race, I think they're all a little bit in the same boat, except you have to give a little bit of the experience edge to Forte and maybe the talent edge. He doesn't blow you away. He doesn't win off by 6 and 7, but he knows where the wire is, and there's something to be said for that.
And that's a perfect segue into getting to Forte, who looked very much the part in the winter and early spring of this year, and then obviously had the unfortunate circumstances leading up, which caused him to miss both the first 2 legs of the Triple Crown. But his run in the Belmont, I thought, was a very admirable run for him, at least a trip I didn't think was his preferred, the 1.5 miles. I think that the 1.25 miles is going to suit him very well. We saw him run very well in the Jim Dandy last time out. I'm curious, we'll start first. I'm curious what you thought of his runs earlier this year and then how he was able to overcome having missed the time pre-Belmont and siphoning that into a nice runner-up effort there.
Well, he debuted in the Fountain of Youth, and I thought it was a perfect comeback race because it wasn't a great field. I didn't think it was sort of the ideal, prep to get shake the cobwebs off of any, residual effects off the layoff, and he ran a very good race that day. The Florida Derby, I thought, he was such a heavy favorite. He was 1-2 in a 9-horse. He was 1-5 in a 12-horse field. You often see that. On paper, he towered over the field, and then around the turn, you thought, well, he's not going to get there. But then he found that resolve, and he found that kick that he seems to find late, and he got there and beat Mage. And really, I don't think anybody really knew what Mage was at that time. And then, 5 weeks later, we knew what Mage was. He was the Kentucky Derby winner. His race in the Belmont, I agree with you. I thought it was an admirable performance. But I think both in the Florida Derby and the Belmont, he ran spotty enough where Pletcher, the trainer, Todd Pletcher, thought, we got to do something to get an entire race out of him. And that's what he did in the Belmont. In the Jim Dandy, he put the blinkers on, and I think that got the horse engaged from start to finish, and you were able to see him run a true race around 2 turns.
And I know that I sort of alluded that I think 1.25 miles is among his best distances. We've, ironically enough, yet to see him at that distance, though. How do you feel the 1.25 miles is going to suit him in the Travers?
Me personally, I don't want to say suspect. I need to see it, I guess. I think he'll get it because I think he'll almost do anything you want to do. But in my opinion, doesn't matter as much as Todd Pletcher's opinion. And in talking to him the other day, he thought it's a non-issue. He said he thinks, he said, look, he was running out of ground in the Belmont. So if he was running out of ground in 1.5 miles, you think 1.25 miles should be fine for him. I think he'll be good, but I don't know that he's the strongest horse in this race at 1.25 miles.
And we move on now to the first of the 3 Triple Crown winners that we have in this race, of course, the Kentucky Derby winner, Mage. And you sort of alluded when you were talking about him earlier as in the quote that you got from his trainer that he is a horse that we probably haven't seen the best of this year. I certainly agree with your assessment that we didn't really know what to make of him going into the Kentucky Derby because he was so lightly experienced going in there. What have you seen from him post Gulfstream? What kind of improvement have you seen from him post Gulfstream, the 2 stakes that he ran in there, into the Kentucky Derby, and then subsequently from that?
Well, he ran a very good race in the Florida Derby. I mean, he was supposed to be in a forward position, and out of the gate, he was last. And I think he had a few gate issues. Going into the Kentucky Derby, I didn't really like him very much because I thought inexperienced horse who has a little bit of issues at the gate, I thought that was a bad combination in what was going to be a 20-horse field, ultimately was an 18-horse field. But I think he proved that he has talent. He got a nice setup and a very good ride from Javier Castellano and got the job done there. I didn't like him in the Preakness because, I think it takes a superior horse to come back in 2 weeks off of a campaign that started in January for this horse in a maiden race, had to get to the Derby. And then I thought, he ran okay in the Preakness, but I wasn't that thrilled with the Preakness field. I will say this about his run in the Preakness, which also was the case in the Jim Dandy. He broke better. He didn't leave himself too much to do as he had in the Florida Derby, and maybe, in my opinion, until he got to the wire first, the Kentucky Derby. So I think the maturity aspect you're seeing in him is at the gates. He's getting out of the gate better in those last 2 races. I figured he'd be a little bit short in the Haskell. I didn't think that the horse that beat him was going to be the one to beat him. I was still a fan of Arabian Night, and I still am. But he wasn't. But he was being asked to do a lot. But I thought Mage got the race that he needed in the Haskell to propel him forward in the to be spot on for this race here Saturday.
And you can, this can sort of be something that can be applied to Forte as well, but how important to you is it for a horse to have a run after the Triple Crown in any race, whether it's the Jim Dandy, whether it's the Haskell or some other race, having that run having a run between the Triple Crown and the Travers?
It's funny you asked that. I was just making a list going back to 2002, when actually 2004 was the last time a horse won the Travers, having not run in since the Belmont. Or at least I thought. Golden Ticket, who dead heated for win in 2012 with Alpha, he hadn't run a race since he was second in a first level allowance race on May 5th, which I believe was Derby Day back then. So, and the body of the evidence here is not very deep. There's only been 4 horses since Golden Ticket who have tried to run from the Belmont to the Travers. It didn't work out for any of them, or Tappert, Gronkowski, and Rich Strike. But so there's not a large sample size here of horses that have skipped it. I think it's important, but I'm also going to leave that up to the individual. When we get to Arcangelo, obviously he's the one who hasn't started since the Belmont. I don't know if it matters to him, just based on what I've been seeing from him in the mornings leading up to this race.
And I'll just mention that I'm very much in the same boat as Dave when it comes to that. I think that preps before any major race are certainly something that are vital. And we'll get to another one of those horses that is going to be trying to do going from the Belmont. One of those horses that's trying to go from the Belmont to the Travers without having a prep, and that's the Preakness winner, National Treasure. And you alluded that you weren't the biggest fan of the field overall from the Preakness, and so I'm curious what you thought of his Preakness effort, and then did you see any sort of improvement or things in the Belmont from him that you think might make him be able to stack up a little bit more against a field of this quality?
Well, I thought in the Preakness, pace makes the race, right? And he had the rail and he had the speed, and I thought he had a big chance when I'm already forgetting. There was a horse trained by Brad Cox who scratched the morning the day before the Preakness, who I thought was the horse to beat in the race, and his name just First Mission. Thank you. So when he scratched, I thought he had enough speed to put himself into the race and be a thorn for National Treasure. When he came out, that left National Treasure to me loose on the lead. Bob Baffert had put blinkers on him for that race. I think he drew the rail. I think everything sort of set up for him. He showed some tenacity in fending off a nice horse in Blazing Sevens, who I'm skeptical of anywhere further than 1 1/8 miles. He probably ran a very respectable race that day to get the 1 3/16 and just to lose only by a head. But no, this horse regressed in the Belmont, coming back in 3 weeks off a pretty hard race, which was his first start since the Santa Anita Derby, the previous was. So he definitely regressed in the Belmont, and I think that's why Baffert is going to take the blinkers off here, hoping that he can get a little bit more of a relaxed type of trip, not too far off the pace. But if he's going to be in front, I think it's going to be one of those deals where he's going to be just more relaxed than he was in the Belmont, where he was kind of a little bit hard on himself.
And I'll ask you, this is a good time, you mentioned the blinkers coming off, and National Treasure very close to the front throughout the majority of he made all in the Preakness, and then also was right up there for the lead throughout the first 1.25 miles of the Belmont Stakes. What do you imagine the pace looks like in this Travers, and with the blinkers coming off, and if he could potentially get loose like he did in the Preakness, how far do you think National Treasure could be able to carry it?
Well, I don't think he gets loose here. I think I think the idea of taking the blinkers off is hoping that he gets a target, and I think they hope that Scotland, who would probably be the longest shot on the board, will be that target. He won the Curlin in front-running fashion, which was 1 1/8 miles here on over the racetrack. That was his first start in a stakes race. I think Scotland is the type of horse that we might see way better down the road, although he's not been a bad horse. He's won 3 or 4 starts. His speed figures are respectable. I just think that there might be a little bit asking against this group, a lot to ask for Scotland. And I think the way I envision the pace scenario here is Scotland going to the front, National Treasure sort of being right off of him, and then horses like Arcangelo, Mage, and Forte in that sort of second flight, jostling for 3rd, 4th, and 5th.
We'll get to the Belmont winner now, and I'm skeptical about a horse's ability to win the Travers without having a run post-Belmont. I know you kind of alluded to that a little bit, but you mentioned that Arcangelo kind of is one that could buck that trend. So first of all, before we get into talking about the runs in the Peter Pan and the Belmont, what do you think about him not having a run between the Belmont and the Travers?
It's my one question mark about the horse, but when you look at his form, so won his maiden race in March off what was a 9-week layoff, or 9 weeks between races. He won the Peter Pan, having 8 weeks between races, and was really hard used to have to beat a nice horse, at least at that distance in that configuration in Bishop's Bay. So he's proven twice now that he can win off of layoffs of 9 and 8 weeks. I think he grew up in the Belmont. I think he's grown up since that race. I'm less, when it comes to this particular horse, I think I'm less skeptical than I would be another horse. I think this is all by design, and I think that there's still gas in the tank here, even though he's run 4 times this year, and going back to December. So it was 5 races have come since December, but I think they're spaced out enough that I think he's, I think he'll be okay. I don't think that will get him beat if he gets beat.
You mentioned that Arcangelo, as you said, grew up in the Belmont, and that provides a good segue to my question for you is, how much improvement did you see in him from the Peter Pan into the Belmont Stakes?
I hadn't really seen much of him before the Peter Pan. I didn't really pay that much attention to him when he was running at Gulfstream. I thought the Peter Pan was a very a telling effort that this horse was, I think the betting, let's say the betting was telling in that race, because he was 5-2 second choice. And, I thought there were some other horses that might take a little bit more action, and he took a lot of it. The fact that he showed some determination and grit to get up over a horse like Bishop's Bay, who was very lightly raced as well, but was, believed to be a really talented horse. I thought that was a telling race for this horse. And then, the one thing with Arcangelo is the trainer, Jenna Antonucci, really spaced his workouts out. And then the Tuesday, I believe it was, of Belmont week, the horse is on the track, and I think I'm not expecting him to do anything. And he goes around there in 5 furlongs, 102. And I'm like, wow, that, is that going to blow his race there? Was that by design? The trainer says it wasn't by design. It was an open gallop. But if that's an open gallop, I'm Brad Pitt. So that was a work. And that horse really, really thrived off that. He didn't do anything like that today. I watched him train today. He was been galloping fine, but he wasn't Tuesday, I should say. That I think he's coming into this race really spot on.
And you mentioned that he's coming into this race really spot on, and having the how beneficial is it for him to have had a race or the experience in a race like the Belmont against the quality of competition that he faced there? And it's not quite the 1.25 miles. It's obviously farther than that, but more similar to the Travers than any of his races that he would have had before that.
Yeah, I mean, it was his first start around 2 turns, and he handled that well. The Belmont was a 1-turn. The Peter Pan, I should say, was a 1-turn 1.1 miles. So that answered that question. He came up on the inside of horses. That answered that question. I just think he's getting more professional with each race. Now, he drifted out late in that race, but you could make a case why he'd be getting tired at the end of a 1.5 miles. And I think that might be another reason why he's been, sort of freshened for this and for whatever else follows this, whether it's to the Breeders' Cup or somewhere else in between. I think everything's sort of been by design. I think, when you have a trainer with a smaller number of horses and can really hone in on one like this, that's this talented and kind of figures out what they think he needs, the horse that is, I think that's a big plus in this horse's corner. Not to say that a trainer like with 300 horses like Todd Pletcher or anybody else couldn't figure this horse out, but I think Jen Antonucci has really figured what this horse needs to fire his best, and I think he's going to give it to us. Now, whether that's good enough to beat Forte again or beat Mage, who he hasn't faced yet, or National Treasure, who he did beat once before, it remains to be seen. But I think you're going to see on whatever this horse is going to give you on August 26th, if it's good enough to beat these horses, I think you're going to see it. I think you're going to see his best for now, and then we'll see how much better he gets later on.
So we'll segue to Todd Pletcher's other expected runner in the Travers this year, and that's Tapix Rice, a horse who, especially in the spring, there seemed like there were a lot of aspirations for him, and it just seems like he's never run. He seems like one of those horses, at least in my opinion, that is perfect for the preps in April, is able to get his couple of wins there, and then he kind of seems like he is a little bit second flight. Kentucky Derby, I thought, showed that. Haskell, at least to me, seemed like it was pretty evident there. Do you think there's anything in Tapit Trice that he could get back to that top, or get back to the top form that there may have been at least hopes that he was post Bluegrass?
I think maybe later on, maybe he's a Tapit. Some of those Tapit progeny get better as they get older, and I think he might be the type of horse that at 4 he could potentially show you something that made them spend $1.3 million for him. Or, I'm not sure what to expect from him on Saturday. He loses his rider. Luis Saez left him to go ride Mage. He gets a more than capable replacement in Jose Ortiz. Todd's making an equipment change by adding blinkers on so that the horse doesn't have as much to do as he's had in his other races. It did work for Forte. He put blinkers on Forte, and he got that to the winner's circle. I just don't know what to expect from this horse. I think I'd be surprised if he won. If I saw him in the trifecta, that would probably be the ceiling for me on him.
We'll move on now to Disarm, Steve Asmussen and Ron Winchell's entrant in the Travers this year. Disarm was a horse that I thought the Kentucky Derby was coming up a little bit too soon for him, but I thought that he was a horse who had real potential to improve and be a very strong late summer runner, and that win was a step forward in that direction. But Jim Dandy, at least on paper, looks like it may have been a step back for him. What was your read on his Jim Dandy effort?
Yeah, I was disappointed. I liked him in the Jim Dandy. I thought, especially when the track came up wet, I thought, well, he just won the Matt win on a sloppy track at Ellis. Maybe the racetrack coming up sloppy was going to help him, but it didn't, and he just kind of ran an evenly uninspiring race. I was surprised that the number came back as well as it did. He got a 101 Beyer speed figure, which is the second best of his life. So that maybe the race wasn't as bad as I thought. And then what they're doing here also is like Todd Pletcher is with Tapit Trice, is they're putting blinkers on this horse. And I did get to catch both of his workouts with blinkers, and especially the one 2 weeks ago was really good with the blinkers on. He was very focused. He galloped out. He was training with a Grade 1 winner named Pauline's Pearl, and left that one on the gallop out. And I thought, maybe he's onto something here. And Gunrunner was the type of horse who got better as he got older. And this horse is a son of Gunrunner who looks almost exactly like Gunrunner. My concern with him is the poor race last time, and has the campaign caught up to him at all? He's another one he's like Forte. He's been going at it pretty good. He's got 8 starts, 6 of them this year, starting in February. You just wonder how he's taking all these races, and whether he's ready to give you a top effort. I'm going to wait and see what the board says. I'd probably throw a few dollars on him just because I think he'll be the value in the race based on and just the way I've seen him train with the blinkers. I still have faith that he's going to be a good horse. He would probably be one I would bet on.
We'll get to Scotland now. We kind of alluded to him earlier. What did you make of his victory in the Curlin Stakes, and what that had done for him from his prior couple of races in Allowance Company?
Well, I think it showed that he can go 2 turns, as most of the progeny of Good Magic, his sire, can. So that was a plus. I didn't think much of the field. Again, Blazing Sevens was in there. He was the heavy favorite. Blazing Sevens just is not that great a horse, I don't think. That would have been his day to win. To me, Blazing Sevens, 1 1/8 against Listed Company. I thought if he was ever going to win again, or not ever going to win again, but it was if he was ever going to win, it would have been that day. And not only did he win, we haven't seen him since, and I think he's getting a rest. But Il Miracolo, the second horse, was scheduled to run Tuesday at Parks in the race called the Smarty Jones. So your listeners can check out and see how he did that day to see if that ups Scotland's flatters Scotland or not. But I think this is one of those deals where it might be a little too much too soon for Scotland, which is not to say that he won't be a good horse. I just be a little surprised if he gets it done on Saturday, although he will be a factor because he does look to be the pace.
And that provides a good segue. So I sort of asked you about this a little bit earlier, and we've discussed it piecemeal throughout, but how do you think this race is going to be run in terms of from a tactic standpoint?
Yeah, I think Scotland gets to the front unless he doesn't want to be there for some reason. He did come off the pace in a one-turn mile situation, but that was the day they went. That was a day in which the pace was very fast, and I don't expect that here. So I think the horses that are the most that expect to be the most forward are Scotland and National Treasure, and I think that'll be a little bit of a rider's race to see who gets to the front. And then I think you'll have sort of a grouping to get to that second flight of Forte and Mage and Arcangelo and maybe even Disarm to a degree. And my guess is Tapit Trice, unless the blinkers really awaken him, will probably be in the back trying to pick up the pieces late. I really think it'll be interesting to see how that second flight develops, who gets to the better part of the racetrack, third, fourth, and fifth, who gets parked out three wide and that sort of stuff. So it'll be interesting between Arcangelo and Mage and Forte on who gets where behind those two front runners.
All right, so the Travers, August 26th, this upcoming Saturday, first time since 2017 that we have all three of the Triple Crown race winners matching up in the Travers this year. Dave Grening, Daily Racing Form, we appreciate your time, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks, Dave.
And a reminder that Racing Rundown will return tomorrow for episode number 218. As it always was, Eric and I will be discussing the fields for the Travers and the accompanying races on that card. We do hope to see you for that episode. We will see you tomorrow. Have a good one, folks. We'll take a step further now here on this WRHU Kentucky Derby preview show, and I have the privilege to be joined once again by Richard Hoiles from ITV Racing, the big race commentator over there, one of the finest race callers in the world. Richard, thank you for taking the time to join us on WRHU today and talk about the classics that you'll have going on this weekend on your side of the pond.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, John. As always, it's nice to chat. Yes, we're pretty close to hand now. I mean, it's been a slow burn this flat season so far on the turf. Easter was an odd time, so we had a couple of meetings, and then we had about 2 or 3 weeks with not a great deal of interest. And then the trials have probably been a bit flat. The weather's not been great. And we sort of arrive in May still feeling that we're almost in the winter time of season. Now, I think things will change markedly. The ground is drying out. At the moment, it's good to firm ground at Newmarket, which we just haven't seen in this country so far this season. Now, there is some rain forecast over the next few days, but I don't think we're going to get the soft and heavy ground that we've had for the majority of the back end of last season, actually, and early this. So we head into a slightly chilly feeling Newmarket for the 2 Guineas, one on the Saturday and one on the Sunday next weekend.
Well, we'll talk about the 2,000 Guineas, and it seems very similar. A year ago, I spoke with you about this time, about a really solid colt of Aidan O'Brien's who had a bunch of promise to his name. His name was, of course, Auguste Rodin, and he went into the 2,000 Guineas, and there was conversations about him potentially being able to contend for the Triple Crown. That was something that the folks over at Ballydoyle had mentioned, and his run in the 2,000 Guineas was a complete non-event, and Aidan O'Brien in the lead-up to it had been talking about how this is one of the horses that he had been the best that he's ever seen. Seems like we're repeating a little bit of the same thing here again, because I know Brian's coming here with a horse that there's a lot of promise to. So first of all, I introduced City of Troy, who is the market leader right now, and I wanted to ask you about his possibilities, to talk about him going into this race, but also for our viewers who are not super familiar with how the classics work over in the UK, to sort of give us a little bit of a set the scene and what's up to come for these 3-year-olds.
Yeah, okay. So our classic generation, if you think about your own Triple Crown, ours varies in distance a little bit more, in the sense that we start at a mile with the Guineas for both the colts. That's the 2,000 Guineas for the colts and the 1,000 Guineas for the fillies. Now, they're run on consecutive days at Newmarket in May, and then round about 5 weeks later, we head off to Epsom, where we repeat the process, but over 1.5 miles or 2,400 metres, where we have the Oaks again for the fillies and the Derby again for the colts. Now, it doesn't stop the fillies running against the boys if they so desire. It's a little while since we had any filly with a chance, although there was an incident a few years ago where Godolphin had a runner who actually went off favourite, a filly, for the Derby. But if they keep their normal paths, we then have a race that's not always contested these days by horses that win the first two classics, and that is the St. Leger. Now, that's over 1.75 miles, and it's become a bit unfashionable for stallions. It's almost too far to win over. So as a result, we don't get many that go for our Triple Crown. The one that lost, and will remain probably one of the biggest regrets for me on a racecourse, was to see Camelot beaten in his attempt to go for the Triple Crown. He was beaten by a Godolphin horse who was trained by Mahmoud Al-Zaruni, who then subsequently was banned for substance abuse, which included a lot of horses, one of which may have been Enki, although he never tested positive on the time. And it was a real shame because he'd won the first two classics, and it was very unusual for a horse to attempt to win the three. Now, as a result, that sort of itch has been left unscratched as regards Ballydoyle. And obviously, those involved in running Ballydoyle are getting on a little bit in years. I'm sure they won't mind me saying so. And so it does crop up with a little more regularity to their horses that they might wish to have a crack at the Triple Crown. And that was thought of for Auguste Rodin. Of course, he blew out early on. He then bounced back in the Derby, never went to the Leger, although Ballydoyle did win it with a different horse. I don't know whether City of Troy will stay anything like the Leger trip, but he is a very, very fascinating horse. They will always, because they're a commercial operation, talk up their horses because, obviously they're looking to stand them at stud after they retire. And in this instance, a little bit like Auguste Rodin, who came from a bloodline that was outside the norm, this is the case this time around as well, with Justified being the sire of the favourite here, City of Troy. And as a result, it would be a very valuable breeding proposition if the horse was to be successful being by Justified.
So I want to talk a little bit about City of Troy, and I mentioned the talk that was about him. This is a horse that is obviously targeting this race and is a hope for the Derby afterwards in 5 weeks on from the Guineas. But I wanted to ask you, what have you seen from him? You've had the opportunity to be behind the headset when this horse has run on a couple of occasions. So I wanted to ask you, what have you seen from him over the course of his 2-year-old campaign? First in July, where he won his first couple of races, and then after a bit of a break where he won over this same course at Newmarket, and just a bit shorter than the mile that he'll go in just over a week's time.
Yeah, so he won his maiden at the Curragh, and was just another one of those sort of, well-bred Aidan O'Brien horses that wins a maiden in Ireland at a short price. He wasn't actually that short. He was 6-4, so it wasn't as if he was 2s on or anything like that. The dam they knew well, a horse called Together Forever, who achieved a good level of form. She ran in some good quality races. She won the Grade 1 Dubai Fillies Mile at 2, and then she didn't quite really train on, which we'll come back to because that might be one of the question marks. I don't know how many races I would call in a year, but you only get that sort of goosebump feeling probably half a dozen times a year, and City of Troy was responsible for it twice, really. First when winning at the July meeting, just a couple of weeks on. This was at Newmarket, just a couple of weeks on after his maiden, where he absolutely slammed Harton by 6.5 lengths, and it was the way when shaken up, he absolutely responded and stormed clear. Now, whenever that happens, it was a Grade 2 race or a Group 2 race in our money. And then he was taken out of a race at the Curragh after an absence of a couple of months. And by the time he lined up in the Dewhurst, it had been almost 3 months to the day since he'd seen a racecourse. There were rumours of setbacks or not being entirely straightforward preparation for him. So we went into the Dewhurst with an open mind as to whether or not he could reproduce on the Rolling Mile what he'd done over the way in the July course, and he was every bit as impressive. He takes an age to pull up, he gallops through the line, and he has that ability that very few horses have to sustain a change of gear right the way through to the line. He really is a fascinating horse. He's one of the most promising horses I would have come across at 2. That doesn't mean they train on. As mentioned, his mum didn't particularly, but he definitely deserves to be the headline act. We'll come on to the fillies, but the colts are much more interesting than the fillies this time around at the moment. And he's top of the tree with Rosalian very, very much close behind, actually. It's an interesting clash. And the horse that City of Troy demolished twice, actually. He beat him in the July Stakes, a horse called Hartum, and then he beat him again in the Dewhurst with a horse called Eben Shaddad in third, and they fought out the finish to the Craven. So all they really did was, Craven being one of our trials at Newmarket last month or earlier on this month, they fought out the finish. So they really franked the form of City of Troy. So the question is, can he do it again? But having done it twice and proven at Newmarket, then I'm very hopeful that you'll see another jaw-dropping performance.
And you mentioned his win in the Dewhurst, and a year ago, Chaldean went on to win the 2,000 Guineas after winning the Dewhurst at 2. How important is it for a horse to have a run over the Rolly course at Newmarket before going into the Guineas? Because in Chaldean's case, he did it twice even though he lost the rider, he did travel over the course in the Craven in the lead up to the 2,000 Guineas.
Yeah, I mean, it is very helpful. The reason is that Newmarket has what you'll hear people refer to as the dip. And basically, it's like a little rise, just about 2 furlongs out, and then you run downhill and you run into a little hollow. And that hollow isn't evenly distributed amongst the course, really. In some cases, it's a slightly deeper descent than others, and it flattens out, and there's undulations. And the ability for a horse to handle that, the key point being when the race is developing, it's when it's quickening. If you can have a horse that handles the dip well, then those that don't change their legs, get unbalanced, whilst the rising ground will see them finish off, they don't go with the same fluency. So it's very, very helpful to have been there. He looks a particularly well-balanced horse, and certainly the dip was not a problem for him last time. And it's interesting, particularly when we move on to the fillies, that you'll find that several of them were brought down for racecourse gallops at Newmarket, even though they didn't actually compete in full-blown races, just to try and acclimatise them to the dip. So the other thing that Aidan O'Brien always says is he always wants to fly his best horses at 2, because that's his preferred mode of travel, and he doesn't want to be trying it for the first day on a classic. So his Guineas horses, you can nearly always identify, they either go to France or they come to England late on in their 2-year-old careers to practice the travel bit as well, and City of Troy has done that twice. So he does have every box ticked, bar the question as to whether he will be as good this year as he was last. But certainly all angles point to him. I'm not telling you anything that the market won't tell you. He's very short-priced favourite, long odds on, even though he's just drifted in the last week or so, because Aidan's horses never run very well over in England in April. He sends the raiding parties. And as a result, City of Troy has just drifted slightly because of the poor performance by some of his stablemates, but I wouldn't let that worry you. I'm pretty sure he galloped today, and all the vibes are good.
And just a quick follow-up, because you mentioned Aidan's prowess to fly horses when they're young. And a year ago when I spoke to you in the lead up to the 2,000 Guineas, there were different flight arrangements that had to be made for the horses because of the circumstances surrounding the King's coronation. And that's not going to be happening this year. So is that going to make any kind of a difference? I don't personally believe that the travel had anything to do with the way that Auguste Rodin in the 2,000 Guineas a year ago was a complete non-factor. But I wanted to ask you, since you're over there and you've seen them, if there will be any kind of noticeable difference this year with the travel situations.
I mean, this is an interesting point, because if you remember, there was also a horse called Little Big Bear, who was a sprinter who was heavily fancied as well, and fluffed his lines off the back of a similar sort of, flight issue. I think the key point is that Aidan O'Brien has developed over the years a routine that suits them best. They fly in and out on the day. At Royal Ascot, they will fly them in and out on 5 consecutive days. They don't bring them all over and stay overnight. Aidan himself will fly in with the horses in the morning. Imagine what a workload that is every week when he's going, 5 days consecutive up at 4 o'clock. And they know that that's what works for them. They believe they want a horse out of an environment that they can't control for as short a period as possible. And so as a result, having the horse in its box till 4 in the morning, flying over on the day, is what they like to do. And any disruption to that, and there has been a couple, as you mentioned, the coronation was one, COVID, of course, was another, and every now and again you get weather conditions that mean that they're preferred approach doesn't work. But I think Aidan will be very, very comfortable that the routine he adopted towards the back end of last year will just be repeated. And I think that's the key, is that it's not superstition, it's just something that down the years they know works, they gear it up accordingly, and it's just, again, another unknown, I think, which they can eliminate. So hopefully he will have a perfectly pleasant flight.
I want to move on now to a few of the other horses. You mentioned Rosaline, who won a Group 1 the weekend of the Arc de Triomphe this past October. So I wanted to ask you for your thoughts on him. Three wins from his 4 starts, including that Group 1 success at the 7 Furlongs trip.
Yeah, he's probably the one that if the ground stays decent in the build-up, then they'll be happy, because his one flop was in the Champagne Stakes on soft ground. When he was sent off favourite, he'd stepped up to Group 2 company, and he was disappointing. He ran very flat. And so he had a few questions to answer when he went to Longchamp, where he was undoubtedly impressive in beating Unquestionable. He was sent off 6-1 that day. He beat a French favourite called Bovatier relatively comfortably. Now, the form hasn't been anything to write home about. Certainly it's not as deep as City of Troy, but his stable has made a good start. And so, if you like, both the front 2 in the market were very pleased with Hartem's victory in the Craven. City of Troy because they'd beaten Hartem twice, but Rosalien because Richard Hannon also trains Hartem, and all of the reports, and they do work together, was that Rosalien was always beating Hartem in their gallops, and so both of them emerged from that with some positivity, and the stable had generally started well. So both of them, I think, would have their chances improved by what went on in the trials, which did not throw up any major candidates, but instead seemed to consolidate this as a clash between City of Troy and Rosalien. But at this stage, you would be comfortable that City of Troy had the deeper form. So Rosalien will have to step forward again, and does have that one blemish on his resume. Maybe it was the soft ground, but he has tasted defeat, which isn't the case for City of Troy, or indeed for a couple of others that are in the field.
You talked about some of the form bouncing back from the Dewhurst, and I wanted to ask you about the runner-up, the horse that was beaten 3.5 lengths behind City of Troy in the Dewhurst at Newmarket, and for your thoughts on him.
Alianabi worked. He did a gallop on the Rolly Mile around the Craven time, so we have seen him. He looked backwards to me. Now, that doesn't mean in the 2.5 weeks he can't take a step forward, but I think probably most of us were slightly underwhelmed by the way he worked. He was second, as you say, to City of Troy. He also only narrowly beat a horse called Boiling Point in a Group 3, and that horse disappointed relatively recently. Now, Eben Shaddad ran okay, finished second in the Craven, but at this stage, it seems to me that Alianabi has got a little bit to prove. He was well beaten by Rosalien, admittedly early on in their careers at the end of July. And the stable do really, really well with Group 1 horses. It just looked to me, on what I saw, that he was a little bit more backward. It has been so cold here, and I'm not 100% sure that he is as far forward as some of the others, although we haven't seen Rosalien or City of Troy, so maybe that's a bit presumptive. But he looked a bit rusty. Maybe it will have knocked the edges off. But Alianabi just had a little bit of a disappointment. He didn't work as quick as I would have liked to have seen him. I think looked to lack a little bit of speed.
And one thing that I'll ask you, because we're talking about some of the top horses in this market going into this race not having run in trials in the year 2024, not having seen the track, and from the American perspective, that's something that doesn't happen in the lead up to the Kentucky Derby. So I'll ask you a more surface level question. Why is it that the not having a trial isn't an issue, or is it something with some horses that maybe a trial is better for them?
Yeah, I think you're right. It depends on the individual horse. Aidan O'Brien does not like trials. So as a result, if you look at the history of Guineas winners, a lot of people now say, they don't need to trial because, lots of them don't. But that's true. But if you strip out the Aidan O'Brien factor, then there are plenty of the UK horses that do trial. Chaldean, you mentioned already, trialled admittedly in the Grening when it all went pear-shaped and he lost the rider, etc. But there's also plenty of instances of the 1,000 guineas in recent years trialling. So I think it depends a little bit on where trainers are with their preparations. It has been very cold in the UK this time around, but obviously a lot of them just run, I won't say second strings, but run sighters, particularly Aidan O'Brien, in the trials to see where they stand. So I wouldn't say it's a hard and fast rule. They are nowhere near as fashionable as they were, and that's really because of the development of the all-weather, both in terms of being able to work horses at home. We don't have the on-track setup that you have over in the States, where you've got access to a racetrack, if you like, whenever you want it. It's a little bit harder in the UK, and as a result, the all-weather season that goes through January, February, March has rather changed the complexion. And I can, use that with a horse in point, Notable Speech, who's currently round about third favourite, who didn't see a racecourse until the 27th of January as a 3-year-old. Won at Kempton, which is an all-weather track on the flat, and has subsequently won twice more at Kempton. So he's never been on turf. Now, he probably has at Newmarket because they've got plenty of gallops there, but he's got very fast sectionals and he looks a flashy horse. But he's coming at it from a completely different profile. So if you like, you could argue he's already had 3 trials because he's run 3 times this year and never ran at 2. So that has changed the way we operate. Knight Raider, who's another unbeaten horse, 2 wins, both at Southwell, another all-weather track. The chances of you seeing a Guineas winner December at Southwell seems pretty remote, but there have been some pretty good horses that eventually developed their way through from the all-weather tracks. Pinatubo was one, Jack Hobbs was another. So it's becoming more fashionable now to run them on the all-weather surfaces than it was. So to answer your question, on the turf, it depends. Most will have racecourse gallops. On the all-weather, it can act as an ideal stepping stone for the same way you'd go through the winter, presumably, for some Kentucky Derby horses, rather than, not see them develop between 2 and 3. You have the option of going right the way through, and the Derby can be the 4th or 5th race of their preparation.
And that's a good segue, because I wanted to talk to you about the pair in the entries right now for Godolphin, and you mentioned Notable Speech. So since we just spoke about him, I'll ask you about him first. What have you seen from his runs at Kempton? And I remember last year going into Epsom, there was a horse that had trialed on the all-weather, the Lingfield Derby trial. Name is escaping me at this point, but I remember you and myself also being somewhat skeptical about his last prep coming over a all-weather surface. So I'll ask you about the runs that we've seen from him, the subsequent 2, especially the one on April 6th at Kempton.
Yeah, that's interesting, because if you remember, it was the weather transferred the Lingfield Derby trial, which is normally run on turf, to dirt. And absolutely, you're quite right. There was a Godolphin horse that won that. The form did not turn out to be at all strong. Now, Notable Speech, it's all about the clock. His last victory, beating Valvano, in just what's an average conditions race. He's never even contested a graded race. But the way he dashed past his rivals off a steady pace, clocking very, very quick sectionals indeed, was what stamped it. Now, the question is, of course, can you reproduce that on a different surface against a higher quality opposition? Is that a possibility, or are you just looking at a horse that's done it against the clock, but when he faces the more serious sort of opposition that he is going to face right from the word go, then that is the main question. He beat a horse called Valvano, who is capable, but certainly nothing special. And Valvano finished second to Notable Speech on his return, so he didn't exactly sort of frank the form. But it was just that visual. It's that eye line when this horse quickened up really, really well. And he's an interesting contender, Notable Speech, I think. But he comes from a very, very different sort of profile. And it remains to be seen whether or not. I was just going to look up those sectional times for you. If you just bear with me, I can probably do that while we talk, because for those that follow the clock, they were ridiculously fast. They were some of the fastest final sectionals that have been recorded at. So we've got the last sections of, he ran at the end of the mile race at 10.93 and 11.08 off what looked a steady pace. The horse that had cut out the running, Valvano, finished second. and Notable Speech finished in 22.01 for the last 2 furlongs, which is very, very quick. It was very quick on the day. And it was a steadily run race. It wasn't a strongly run race. So he's quickened off the back. But can he do that? He hasn't been in Newmarket. He hasn't faced the turf. He hasn't faced the opposition. But on the clock, that's what the people will be looking at.
And I'll ask you about the other horse who won the now renamed, whatever the front name of it is. I can't remember off the top of my head, but the Futurity Trophy at Doncaster, Ancient Wisdom, that the final Group 1 of your season over there, over the heavy going. I wanted to ask you about him, the other chance right now, the other major chance right now for Godolphin.
Yeah, I can't. I'd be surprised if he runs, to be honest. He was beaten by Rosalian in that race we're talking about. It's quite an amazing race, really, because Rosalian beats Al Muzmak, Ancient Wisdom, and Al Nianabi in a listed race at Ascot on the 29th of July. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that all 4 of those could line up in the Guineas. Ancient Wisdom needs soft ground. If it doesn't dry up, and he stayed a mile well on heavy ground at 2, I think they will put all their eggs in, 2 baskets, really. Notable Speech, I think, for the majority, and obviously when we get on to the fillies with Dance Sequence. But in terms of this, I would be surprised if Ancient Wisdom ran. I would be expecting Ancient Wisdom, just check his entries, to head for the Dante, and he's got an entry in the Dante. He is entered in the Guineas, so they're taking the next stage. But I would have thought he might be heading for the Dante. He does hold an Irish 2,000 Guineas entry as well, but that's a very early entry. And he's entered in the Derby as well, over 1.5 miles. So I'd be surprised if the ground was quick, whether he runs at all. But I don't think he would be fast enough if he did on that ground. If it came up an absolute bog, things become somewhat different. But that's not what the forecast is suggesting, and it's certainly not what the current ground conditions are.
We'll switch gears now to the 1,000 Guineas the day after the 2,000 Guineas. I'll start with your surface level viewpoint of the 3-year-old fillies right now, and then we'll talk about a few of them here.
Yeah, not as good as the boys at this stage. That doesn't mean it won't be an interesting race, because it is much more open. With the exception of one with Fallen Angel, which we'll come on to these specifics, you have to forgive virtually all of the others for something. There's a blip in their form. There's a question mark. They've been beaten by other horses. There is not the standout City of Troy or even Rosalian amongst the fillies. Now, that doesn't mean one can't emerge. It means the likelihood is there will be a big field, and then we get into all sorts of differences about the draw and whether they'll split into 2 groups and all sorts of things. I can see this being a big field where plenty will throw their hat into the ring. So the overview is, as we stand at the moment, the Colt has a fascinating clash between 2. The Guineas, for the 1,000 Guineas, you could probably take 8 to 10, and it wouldn't necessarily amaze if any of those won.
So I guess we can start off with Fallen Angel, whose big success came at the Curragh, winning the Moyglare Stud a year ago back in September. So I'll start with her with you.
Yeah, and she's the one who has the least questions to answer, I suppose. She did get beaten by Shawari at Sandown in a listed race, but then she stepped up with a good victory at Newmarket on the July course. And then, as you mentioned, she took advantage of one of her major anti-post rivals for the Guineas, Yalang's complete and utter dismal run in the Moyglare to win. Now, when she won, there was a lot of talk saying, well, what did she beat? And that is a valid question, because Vespertilio and Ornelea, who were second and third, up until that point, hadn't looked anything out of the ordinary, although Vespertilio's form was pretty solid when you looked back through it. So the question for Fallen Angel was really whether she just took advantage of a relatively weak Group 1 with Yalang, who was a short price favourite, was short of 6 to 5 that day, so Aidan didn't run lots of them. But she has made steady progress. She's worked at the track. She won over on the July course, which is a different course, but it also features undulation, so it's not completely different to what the horse will face on the Rolly Mile. And she looked as if she would stay at the Curragh. She was strong at the finish. The ground looks like being fine, and she is the one who has the least queries, other than what was she left to beat when Ylang blew out in the Moyglare?
And I want to move on now to Ylang, who does have the experience over the trip, this time exactly at the trip, winning the Phillies Mile on October 13th. So we'll move on, and I'll ask you about her now, because you mentioned she blew out at the Curragh, followed it up with a third-place finish at Newmarket, and then at the 7 furlong trip, and then moving up to the Mile, did get the win, narrowly, though, as you mentioned, over Shawari.
Yeah, she is a little bit of a puzzle for me, in the sense that you were just about to think that she was a hype horse. I mentioned with regards to City of Troy, you get lots of horses that win short-priced maidens over an island, and she was the case. She was the same. Didn't see her to the end of June. She won 8-13. She was sent off favourite, so short price at the Curragh. She won, and then she beat Vespertio in a Group 3 race at Leopardstown, and she appeared as if this was something that was a pretty special horse, well touted by Aidan O'Brien, went to that Moyglare that we've spoken about, sent off just a 6-5 favourite, and finished last. And not only finished last, but folded very tamely when she was headed. She then followed it up with a run at Newmarket, which again was nothing flash. This time, she was out the back, and you just thought, well, this is a hype filly. And then she went and won right at the back end, the Phillies Mile, leading close home to beat Shawari. And See the Fire is also potentially in the field next weekend. I don't know. Aiden's August Rodan, Little Big Bear, they all bounced back off of pretty average runs. Certainly August Rodan, but I don't know about Ylang. I wasn't 100% convinced. I don't like to see a filly fold so tamely as she did in the Moyglare. So for me, she would be a pass. Not 100% sure that form is that strong, but as I say, See the Fire represents it as well, and See the Fire's in about 4th or 5th place in the market, which just shows, I think, how it lacks depth in comparison to the Colts.
So I'll ask you a final note on the 2000 Guineas. Of the horses that we haven't discussed yet, where are some of the places that you're looking for? Some of the other horses that in just over a week's time will be showing up in this race, who might some of the promising types be?
So for the 1000, Ramatuelle, who has had a very consistent, a very good 2-year-old career, raced 5 times, just got beaten in the Morney by Van Dijk, who's turned out to be a very smart sprinter. That was over 6 furlongs. She has had a prep race, and she was beaten at Deauville by Romantic Style, but she didn't have an overly hard time. Christopher Head has been in the news recently as his major patron is taking horses to be trained by his own effectively private trainer, and that's taken away some of the really good horses that Christopher did so well with last year, but not Ramatuelle. And what could be a massive weekend for Justify, because she is a Justify filly, so what a double that would be for the sire if he was able to have the winner of the 1000 Guineas with Ramatuelle and the 2000 was City of Troy. If it rained all week and came up soft, then one look is definitely worth a second look. But by Glen Eagles, that is a soft ground sire. And if it dries up, then she was amazingly impressive in a sales race. Sales races are big pots that those that go through particular sales are eligible to run in. And she, on her debut, absolutely demolished a field of 20-odd and ran away from a horse called Cherry Blossom, who'd been group placed for Aidan O'Brien and won by 6 lengths. She's also had a run. Turned up at Cork in a run-of-the-mill race on heavy ground, and as you'd expect at 1-20, destroyed the opposition. But I do think she needs it soft. So those two would be top of my list for the varying ground requirements. Dance Sequence got beaten in the Nell Gwyn on her return, and I didn't like the way she wobbled under pressure. She's beaten by Pretty Crystal, who is almost certain to be supplemented for the race. She wasn't in the original entries, but I do expect her to be supplemented at the 5-day stage. I wasn't sure she would stay. So outside the front two, I think Ramatuelle is by far the most interesting horse if they choose to send her over. And Christopher Head likes international competition. He's made that plain off the back of the Head families. A great history in that regard. And Ramatuelle, I think, would be the most interesting one of the others.
Well, Richard Hoiles, who will call them down that Rolling Mile course this weekend at Newmarket. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us this year.
My pleasure, and I hope you enjoy the coverage. And let's hope, in case of City of Troy in particular, he is the horse that could give you goosebumps. So hopefully he will do well. And it's worth pointing out, I don't know how they're doing in the States, but Justify's ability to produce top quality horses around the world on both surfaces is making him an extremely interesting sire. So it could be a good weekend for him.
All right, and with that said, we'll send it now back into the studio with the crew there.